Living in a small town has its advantages. For example, you get to know everyone who lives there pretty quickly. If you ever have a problem, chances are that there's someone in town with the expertise to help you. Like Jimmy, our local handyman, electrician, and plumber. If you have a household problem, Jimmy's your guy. If you got a more difficult problem, then you probably want Mac. He's our town sheriff, the only law enforcement we have for a few miles. Are you feeling hungry? Then Sherry's the gal for you. She runs a diner in the center of town, and her pie is out of this world. What I'm trying to say is that it pays to know people. Another thing I find fantastic about living in a small town is the sheer amount of nature that surrounds us, untouched by man. The trees seem to grow endlessly into the sky. The nearby creek is crystal clear, not like those contaminated ones I hear about in the city. But I think the best part about living so far away from the city is the peace and quiet. It's intoxicating. Occasionally, sometimes you'll hear the rumbling of a semi-truck passing by, but that's about it. You could step outside your door at any given time and be greeted with pure silence. I have always found the silence peaceful, like our town was secretly tucked away from the rest of the world. Even though I do enjoy the peace and quiet, that's not always the case for a lot of people. I work in the only gas station for miles, and we often get a lot of people stopping by there to refuel before heading back onto the road. Even though most of the people tend to fill up at the pump and continue their journey, sometimes I'll still get people to come inside, and they'll mention how unnaturally quiet it is in this town. Since I only lived in this town my entire life, I never noticed how different it is from the rest of the world. But I'll just take their word for it. It just makes me uneasy, is what one of the customers said to me when I inquired. They said they couldn't put their finger on it. Just something about the silence of our town made them uncomfortable. Well, this town makes me uncomfortable too, but it's not the silence that drives my fear. It's something that happened to me when I was a kid. My friend Tommy and I were always together as children. We would do everything together. Explore the forest, fish in the creek, play in one of the many meadows that littered our town until the moon signaled our curfew. It was early October when it happened. We were playing together as usual, riding bikes up and down the town, until he got the bright idea to pay a visit to the Blackbriar farm. Now, this farm has a bit of history, but I'll try to sum it up. Basically, the Blackbriars were the first to settle in this town. They were a working class family, and their main export was corn. They had cornfields as far as the eye could see. The town itself was in the early stages of forming next to the farm. Then one day, in the middle of October, the entire Blackbriar family disappeared. Nobody knew why. Some people said that the head of the household, Michael Blackbriar, took sick and passed away, and at that point, the farm was too much to maintain without him, so his family left the farm for greener fields. Others think a pack of wolves or some other animal got to the family and tore them apart, and they were never seen again. Regardless of what happened, the farm was abandoned and had been left untouched for decades. For some reason, our town either didn't have the will or the means to tear the farm down and start something new, so the old farmhouse was just left, standing there. Even though the house remained empty, the cornfield seemed to continue to grow year after year. They would produce, and even our local market owner would pick fresh corn from the field and use it. There's no point in letting it go to waste, they would say. Then the field would wither and die, only to regrow all over again the following year. So Tommy wanted to go exploring in the field. He had this absurd notion that the Blackbriars had a stash of treasure somewhere on the farm itself. After all, they were a supplier of produce for a while, and the town didn't have a bank during those times, so they had to do something with all that money. Well, the sun was quickly setting as we approached the edge of the farm. Reluctantly, I followed Tommy into the looming forest of dried corn husk. Our footsteps crunched beneath us as we marched further inward. It was deafening how loud our footsteps were in comparison to the rest of our surroundings. As we pressed on, we began to hear a new sound. It was faint, over the crunch of our footfalls at first, but as we walked closer, the sound grew louder. It was crying. Someone was sitting in the cornfield, softly crying to themselves. Unsure of the situation, I asked Tommy if we could head back, but he shook his head, mentioning that someone might need our help. We found ourselves in a small clearing in the field. On the other side from where we entered, we saw it, or I should say, her. It was a woman. She was sitting on the cold ground. She was wearing a silky white dress, which had been stained by the dirt she rested on. Long brownish black hair covered her face and shoulders. She sat facing away from us, and the sobs that she was doing seemed to reverberate off the surrounding stalks of corn. Tommy, fearlessly, approached her and asked her if she was alright. When he did, her sobs instantly stopped, and the overwhelming silence returned. She rose to her feet, still facing away from us. I took a step backward, while Tommy took a step ahead. Then she turned, but how she did it triggered alarms off in my head. 1 second, she was facing away, and in the blink of an eye, she was turned towards us, as if she were a glitch in a video game. She raised her head, and her hair parted from her face, revealing a gory facade. Its flesh clung to her skull like tape. Half of her jawbone was exposed. Her eyes were gray and lifeless. Dirt seemed to pepper the remaining parts of her skin, which combined to form a sickly brownish color. Tommy and I both screamed. I immediately turned to run away, but then I heard Tommy call out to me. My body reacted on its own, and I turned back. Tommy had been grabbed. Her hand gripped his wrist so tight that even from where I was standing, I could hear the bones in Tommy's wrist begin to splinter. Her mouth began to open and separate, as if she were some sort of snake-like creature. She pulled him closer and raised him up. Tommy struggled to turn his head away from the creature to look at me, and managed to say one thing to me, the last thing I would ever hear from my best friend. "Run!" And I did. I ran through the cornfield as fast as I could. Tears streamed down my face like a waterfall as I realized I left my best friend behind to die. I made it to my bike and pedaled as fast as I could to the police station. I told Mac everything that happened. He quickly gathered up a search party, and it was almost every single person in town. After going through the cornfield for hours, they found no trace of the woman, and the only thing they found of Tommy's was a shoe. Weeks turned into months, which turned into years. Eventually, everyone in the town started to forget. It was just another tragic missing child's case to everyone, aside from Tommy's parents and myself, that is. New children began telling stories about the cornfield, how anyone who goes in is never heard from again. Those stories aren't entirely accurate, because I was there with Tommy that day, and I made it out, alive. Not a single day goes by that I don't regret what I did, and not a single night goes by that I don't have to drink myself into a drunken slumber. Ever since I started working at this gas station, I saved up enough money to move away from this town for good, to start a new life somewhere, far away, away from the cornfield, and away from the tragic memory of my dear friend. I plan on leaving at the end of October, but 2 nights ago, after I was closing up the gas station, I heard it. The silence broken by some faint sobs coming from the other side of the road. My body seized as I saw her, standing there on the other side of the road. I wanted to believe that I was just seeing things, but I knew better than that. She was facing away from me, and without even giving her a second to turn around, I ran to my car, got inside, and drove away. I'm at home right now, and I wanted to type this up before I leave this place for good, just so whoever hears this knows how sorry I am for Tommy, and to stay away from the Blackbriar farm. I'm not really sure where I'm gonna go, but I need to hurry. I left my window open, and I think I just heard some crying coming from outside. So if I don't make it, remember, if you hear a woman softly crying to herself, just stay away and call the police. Or you might end up just like my best friend, Tommy. I pulled into the bar parking lot and stopped the car. I sat there for a moment, letting the engine idle as I thought about what I was doing. I knew my wife and kids were at home, waiting for me, but I just couldn't bear to face them right now. The thought of spending another evening with them, avoiding the elephant in the room, made me physically sick. I closed my eyes and cursed myself. Everything was going to shit. My wife was pregnant with our fourth child, and I simply wasn't making enough money to support us. Over the past 6 months, our quality of life had slowly declined, and it was becoming harder and harder to explain to the kids what was happening. My wife and I loved each other, but the financial difficulties sprouted endless arguments that could last late into the night. The truth was, I was scared. I didn't know what was going to happen to us. I didn't know how to pull my family out of this terrifying nosedive, and I couldn't stop thinking about it. I couldn't stop thinking about that day when we would be kicked out of our house. I started having trouble sleeping, and my mood worsened. I would find myself snapping at the kids over little things. So instead of taking out my fear and frustrations on my family, I started to drink after work. At first, it was just a beer or two, something to take the edge off. But after a month, I began to stay late, drinking more and more. It was time that I needed to think. It was a few moments of peace. My wife hated my habit, and I didn't blame her. She never argued with me about it. But when I came home reeking of beer and whiskey, she would have this look that said everything. I never really was a drinking man before I fell on hard times. Even in college, I never drank much. Never to the point of being seriously drunk. I just didn't see the point. But now that my life was crumbling before my eyes, I found comfort in drinking. It was a space I could enter and push my thoughts to the edge of my tired mind. And tonight, I needed a drink. Before leaving work, my boss told me that they were conducting layoffs in the coming weeks. He didn't go into detail, but as I sat in my car, I realized that he was unofficially informing me that I would soon be jobless. I felt sick. What the hell am I gonna do? How was I going to provide for my family? Growing up, I never expected this. Why would I? The thought of my kids made me terribly depressed. They depended on me. They looked up to me. How was I supposed to tell them Daddy couldn't pay the bills? I pulled my car door open and forced my mind to settle. I licked my lip. I almost ran into the bar. Music droned somewhere above me as my eyes roamed around the room. Neon beer signs lined the walls and their colors trailed in the air as I sipped my 6 rum and coke. My head was floating above my shoulders, and the conversation around me slurred and streaked like wet paint. I licked my lips and they felt bloated on my face. I blinked lazy and realized I was taking a heavy breath. I shifted on my bar stool and almost fell off. My mind exploded with dizziness and my stomach churned. How many beers had I had before starting the endless rum and cokes? I couldn't remember. The bar was surprisingly full, but I couldn't focus on any individual faces. They piled around me, trying to get in drinks, and I felt like a rock sticking out in the middle of a moving stream. I raised my glass to my mouth and drained the last of its contents. "Hey Jack, you should go home, buddy," the bartender said, leaning towards me out of the pool of mixing colors. "Maybe one more, and then I'll head out," I mumbled, raising my head to meet his gaze. His face swam before me, and I closed one eye to stop it from moving. "I think you're done, buddy. Come on, go home to your family." I could feel darkness swirling around the edge of my vision. I snorted and the bartender shook his head. "Hey, Jack, you want me to call you a cab?" For some reason, I found this incredibly offensive, and I shook my head violently. Piss off. I'll be fine." My head felt like a bloated boulder. I dug into my pocket and pulled out some crumpled cash. I threw it on the bar and stumbled towards the door. I felt like I was walking through a movie scene that I wasn't supposed to be in. People were turning to stare at me, and I was too drunk to register shame, and I shoved some punk kid aside and pushed myself out the front door. The world rocked beneath my feet, and I felt a sudden urge to vomit. I exhaled slowly and dragged my feet towards my car. I was in no state to drive. I grit my teeth and checked my watch. It was after 10. Shit. I banged into my car, still looking at my watch, and let out an angry grunt. I ran my hands over the door until I found the handle and pulled it open. I didn't dare look at my phone and see how many missed calls I had. I sighed as I climbed into the driver's seat. I needed to rest for a moment, settle my head. Then I would drive home and apologize to my wife. I would wait to tell her about the layoffs that are coming. But first, I needed to sleep. I closed my eyes, and darkness rushed me. "Hey there, Slick." I pulled my eyes open. Blinding sunlight immediately forced them shut again, and I rubbed my face, trying to clear my mind. To my surprise, I felt alright. In fact, I felt fantastic. I opened my eyes again and sunbeams warmed my face. I was sitting in a sprawling green meadow. Birds chirped overhead, and green grass rustled beneath me, a pleasant breeze chuckling through the air. I was sitting against a tree in a circular clearing, with swaying forest that wrapped around a sparkling pond. It was breathtaking. For the first time in months, I felt peace settle in around me. The blue sky overhead was cloudless, and I closed my eyes as I raised my face to absorb the gentle sunlight. Beautiful, ain't it? I snapped out of my trance and shot a look over to my left where the sudden voice had come from. There was a man, sitting against a tree, not 5 feet from where I sat. He was in his mid-40s and was wearing a tan suit, a silver watch on his wrist, and his sports jacket wrinkled against the bark. His green eyes sparkled underneath the brim of a blue baseball cap. "Where am I?" I finally asked. The last thing I remember was passing out in my car, drunk off my ass. The man smiled to reveal perfect teeth. Don't worry about that. Ain't no use in it. Just relax and enjoy all this." His accent added to the pleasing atmosphere, and I found myself comfortable around this stranger. My wife. I need to get back to her. And my kids, I said without much conviction. It was just so impossibly gorgeous here. I knew that I needed to get home, but the overwhelming calm I felt made it hard to put action behind my words. "They're not going nowhere, Slit," the man said, closing his eyes and taking a deep breath through his nose. "Just take a load off and enjoy yourself." I leaned back against my tree and ran my hands through the blades of grass. The woods filled my head with a beautiful scent, a combination of dirt and fresh rain on wood. The pond before me glittered like a mirror, filled with diamonds, and I found myself smiling. Whatever this place was, I never wanted to leave. All my worries seemed so trivial here. The overbearing stress I had felt earlier was gone. By the way, I'm Russ, the man said suddenly from his spot. I turned and saw his eyes were still closed, but he had a small smile. I'm Jack, I answered, watching a silver fish jump from the surface of the pond to snatch a bug. The man chuckled. Oh, I know who you are, Slick. I cocked my head at him. Who are you? What is this place? Russ adjusted the ball cap on his head before answering. I just told you, I'm Russ. And this, he spread his hands. This is just a little slice of peace, buddy. Ain't nothing more. Can I stay here? I asked. Russ snorted, but there was no malice in it. I'm afraid not, partner. That wouldn't be good. This place isn't meant for that. Not anymore. I raised an eyebrow. Not anymore? Before he could answer, a noise echoed in the forest around us. It was distant and low. A single deep note that crawled up the sky and fell upon us. It sounded like the beat of a great drum. Russ pulled his cap and sat a little straight. What was that? I asked him. As the sound faded, Russ looked at me, his eyes uneasy. That's why you can't stay here for very long. The drum sounded again, and again, and again. A constant beat that filled the woods with a single ominous note. And for some reason, it filled me with a creeping dread. Not good, Russ mumbled under his breath. What is it? I stressed, feeling uneasy. Russ stood up, brushing himself off. It's the whistling man. He's bad news, Slick. You don't want to be around if he shows up. I wasn't following anything he said, and it must have shown on my face because he raised his hands. Listen, you need to leave, he said as the drum slowly began to grow louder. Why? What's gonna happen? Russ waved me off. Nothing good, Slick. I'll tell you that much. You can come back, but not when he's around. But where is here? I sputtered as Russ advanced on me. Before he could answer, the forest filled with a piercing cry, a sharp whistle that cut through the sky and echoed all around us. I slammed my hands over my ears as the deafening note danced across the sun rays and exploded across the meadow. As the wavering echo faded, another whistle followed. This time, lower, sorta haunting, that chilled me instantly. The drum was growing louder, and I thought I felt the earth shiver slightly beneath my feet. Russ turned to me, his eyes wide. Get out of here. Go. He shoved me backwards and I stumbled, tripping over my feet, and woke up gasping in my car. I immediately opened the door and vomited into the parking lot, a great gush of hot stomach bile and gurgling rum. Tears leaked from my bloodshot eyes as I sat up and wiped my mouth. My head was splitting and I was desperately thirsty. I looked at my watch and groaned. It was a little after midnight. I took a few seconds to collect myself, thinking back on what I had just experienced. What just happened? I could still hear the echoing shrill note of that whistle. Or did I? I ran my hands over my face, the consequences of my nighttime drinking churning my stomach again. How was I going to explain this to my family? What would I tell my wife? I know she was going to be furious. I suddenly wished I was back in the meadow. The serene peace it had offered upon arrival was intoxicating. No worries, no stress, no responsibilities, just warm sun and beautiful, accepting nature. As I started my car, I made a mental choice. I would do anything to go back. And now, I thought I knew how to get there. The next 2 days were a waking hell. As expected, my wife was pissed. She wasn't a woman who yelled or threw things. I almost wish she was. Instead, she turned to ice, barely acknowledging my existence. I try to be extra active with the kids, even taking them out for ice cream. But still, that wasn't enough to get my wife to warm to me. It was the weekend, and every minute seemed like a chore. On the outside, I was super dad, making sure to always wear a smile and engage my kids in conversation and playful fun. None of this made me and my wife closer, and I felt the thirst return to me with a vengeance. I still hadn't told her about the layoffs, and judging by her mood, I wasn't gonna tell her until her fury had passed. When Sunday night rolled around and she still wasn't talking to me, that's when I decided that after work the following day, I would return to the bar and get shit-faced again. I needed to see if I could go back to that meadow. I needed it, in the worst kind of way. My own sanctuary of peace. I knew it was the worst thing I could do, but the frustrations of the weekend pushed logic out of my frazzled mind. She didn't fully understand the stress and worry that I was going through. She didn't know the weight I carried every day. It wasn't her fault, but I expected her to cut me some slack. As I slid into bed that night, I licked my mouth and focused on tomorrow. The need was so great, I almost got up and left right there and then. What little reason I still possessed forced my eyes closed instead, and I tried to summon the vision of the meadow. I could almost feel it, waiting for me right behind my eyes. If I focused hard enough, I thought I could smell the greenery swirling through the swaying forest. If I shut everything out, I thought I could hear the frogs croaking at the edge of the water. Was that Russ? I was sure. I had just heard him speaking to me, but it was all just out of reach. For whatever reason, I couldn't quite access that special place. I needed a catalyst. And that's how I found myself slumped over the bar the following night. The day seemed like forever. The clock indifferent to my desperation. On the way to work that morning, I had stopped at the liquor store, but had managed to hold off. My boss didn't say anything to me, which I took as a good sign. My wife still wasn't talking to me, barely looking my way as she got the kids ready for school. I had tried to give her a hug goodbye, but she brushed me off, saying something that she had to finish packing lunches. This sparked an anger in me, and I left the house, clamping my teeth shut so I wouldn't say anything stupid. I knew getting wasted tonight wasn't gonna repair any teetering marriage, but I had been pushed to my limit. If she wasn't gonna forgive me, then what was the point? Her morning coldness had cemented my resolve to go out tonight, and I barely felt any guilt. I justified it in my mind. As I pulled into the bar parking lot, I felt a cool blanket of relief sweep over me. This was where I could let go a little. This was where I didn't have to think about my issues. I tipped the glass to my mouth and sucked the rum off the ice cubes. I hadn't bothered mixing my drinks tonight. I had a destination in mind, and I wanted to get back there as soon as possible. Judging by the way the room swam, I was doing a pretty good job of it too. The bar was empty, and I was relieved for it. A quiet tune played from the retro jukebox in the corner, and I hummed along as I tapped the bar for another refill. The usual bartender was off tonight, Kenny, and I was grateful for it. He had a tendency to cut me off, and I didn't want that tonight. I smiled at the young lady, and I said thanks as she placed a fresh rum in front of me. I was trying my best to maintain my composure. I didn't want to stop drinking until I couldn't see. I drowned half the rum in one swig, and felt it slam into my stomach like a derailed train. I burped behind my hand, and felt my eyelids swell. I smacked the taste from my mouth and my tongue burned with alcohol. My thoughts had become hard to control, the alcohol filling my mind like a sinking ship. I had been here for 3 hours, and I felt like if I tried to stand, there was no guarantee my legs would obey. I tipped the glass to my lips one last time, and that was enough to cloud my vision with a heavy fog. Blackness pressed in on my sloshed brain, and I ran a hand over my face. It felt like there was a face over my face. I giggled at the thought, but was suddenly overcome with sadness. I blinked a few times and decided it was time. I cashed out with a mumbled thanks to the bartender and very carefully walked out to my car. The world rocked beneath my feet, and the full moon was so bright I had to shut one eye against it. My head felt thick, and every breath tasted like ice and spiced rum. I stumbled to my car and managed to get the door open before collapsing into the driver's seat. I rolled my head back and shut my eyes, a small smile on me. I waited for it to happen. Hey there, Slick. I opened my eyes, and gentle sunlight lit my vision. Stunning greens and blues melted together to form breathtaking beauty, and my senses filled with the peaceful meadow before me. I was back. The dense forest encircling this pocket of paradise swayed gently in the breeze, the leaves rustling together to form a serene soundtrack to the majesty of this hidden nature. The grass was soft beneath me, like cool blades of emerald silk. I ran my hands through it and leaned comfortably against the tree I sat under. The pond before me was captivating in its stillness, a plate of shining silver. I turned and saw Russ sitting a few trees over. His tan suit jacket was balled behind his head, and he leaned comfortably against it. I had to come back, I said. This place. I trailed off, trying to find the words. It's something special, ain't it? Russ grinned, crossing his feet in front of him. Yeah, you got that right. Silence passed between us, and I sighed, my head empty of worries, and was filled with complete tranquility, the secluded isolation adding to calming magic of the meadow, and pleasant birdsong danced between the trees. Again, I was filled with the desire to never leave this place. Everything was just so perfect. It made life seem unfair in comparison. Why were things so hard? Why did misfortune and approaching despair plague my every day? Why couldn't I just stay here, away from all of that, and close my eyes in peace? This was all I needed. You know, Russ said from his spot, as much as I enjoy your company, I worry about you. I looked over at him. Why is that? Russ adjusted his baseball cap. You know why. Don't make me say it, Slick. Can you just let me enjoy the quiet? I said, shutting my eyes. Russ grinned. Of course, but I need you to know something. Before he could continue, a distant drum began to beat. I opened my eyes. Russ pointed out into the woods, towards the noise. That. What about it? I asked softly. Russ stared at me under the brim of his cap. That didn't used to be here. I nodded towards the distant drum. That? The drum? His green eyes bored into my skull. Not just the drum. Him. I stared. Russ's voice dropped to a whisper. The whistling man. You can tell when he's around. When the drum starts. He's looking for you, Slick. And he's never gonna stop. I shifted uncomfortably. Who is he? What does he want? Russ stared out into the forest. Do you really have to ask? I suddenly threw my hands up in frustration. What are you talking about? Before he could respond, the air filled with a shrieking note, a long high whistle that bore into my head like a screaming drill. Swarms of birds erupted from the trees and took flight, escaping the sound. Russ jumped to his feet, with fear all over his face. "You better scram, Slick. It sounds like he's close." "I don't want to," I shouted, climbing to my feet. "I don't care about him. I don't care what he wants. Anything is better than going back to out there." Jabbing my finger towards the sky, Russ approached me as the drum beat grew louder. Another whistle slicing through the meadow like a razor blade. It was the same low note as last time, but despite that, the thought of leaving made me want to weep. I had only just arrived. I couldn't leave yet. I couldn't face what awaited me on the other side. "He doesn't have to be here," Russ said urgently. "You have to get rid of him. It wasn't always like this." The drum was deafening at this point, and I felt the soil beneath my feet begin to tremble. Russ opened his mouth to speak, but then a new voice erupted from inside the forest. A horrible, deep voice of rage.
"Jackie. Where are you, Jackie?"
Another series of long whistles followed, cracking the air like a bullwhip. The eyes of Russ went wide, and the blood drained from his face. He took a step and raised his hands to me. "Go! Go!" He shoved me, hard, and I went sprawling backwards, and woke. Nausea tossed my stomach, and I slammed the door open and emptied my gut onto the asphalt. I screamed, wiping my face and pounding on the steering wheel. "No! No! I can't be here. Let me go back." Faced once again with my looming, life-ruining problems filled me with absolute panic. The night air filled with indifferent moonlight, and I raised my eyes to the sky. "I can't do this anymore. Russ, let me come back." I thought I could feel his presence, a tickle in the back of my head. I focused on it, begging to be swept away to the calming meadow. I didn't care about this whistling man. I didn't care about what he wanted. I couldn't face my family right now. I didn't want to think about work or money. I just wanted to go back. "Please, help me." Slamming my fist into the dashboard. "Take me back, please." I sat there for a moment, trembling, bloodshot eyes catching focus on everything. Then, nothing. I wiped my face. "You can't do this to me. You can't make me stay here." I checked my watch and saw that it is midnight. Last call wasn't for another hour and a half. I licked my lips and ran a hand through my hair. I felt like crap. I knew I probably looked like crap too, but that wasn't gonna stop me. "I'm coming back," I said, stepping out of my car, avoiding the puddle of vomit. "And I'm not gonna let you send me away this time." My legs wobbled as I carefully made my way back inside the bar. I steadied my breathing and summoned as much willpower as I could. It wasn't easy. My throat burned and my eyes were watering. The world rocked and swayed beneath me, and I grit my teeth against it. I pushed the bar doors open and slowly made my way back to my stool. I motioned for the bartender and she returned to me. She told me she was surprised to see me back, and I told her my car wasn't working. I told her a friend was coming to give me a lift, and I was just coming back in to kill some time. I spaced out my words and tried my best not to slur. I asked her if she could load me up a beer and a shot. She chewed her lip for a moment, and I could see her thinking, my intoxicated state apparent no matter how good an actor I thought I was. I reached into my pocket and slid her 2 20s, tipping her a wink. The money shattered any moral disputes she had been fighting against, and she quickly cracked the top of a beer. She filled a shot glass and placed it in front of me, telling me to behave myself. I thanked her and assured her that I would. When she turned away, I slammed the shot, gasping at the sudden charge of heat. Whatever edge I had lost from vomiting returned as the rum hit my system. I snatched the beer up and sucked it down, with the last drop sliding onto my tongue. I felt sick, like a soaked sponge left on the counter. I looked around, the room moving and swaying, and saw there were only 2 other people. They were over in the corner, not paying attention. and to my delight, I saw them wave over to the bartender. It looked like they knew her. She shot a quick look at me, and then went over to them. Heart racing, consciousness blinking, I quickly leaned and snatched the half-full bottle of rum from the counter. I chanced to look over my shoulder and saw that my act had gone unnoticed. "You can't get rid of me," I mumbled, tipping the bottle to my mouth. "You can't make me stay here." I closed my eyes and drank. I didn't stop until everything went dark. I gasped and opened my eyes. Soft clovers tickling my face. I breathed in and sighed, relief running through me. I got to my knees, pulling myself up, and surveyed the meadow. Something was wrong. The sun was hidden behind thick gray clouds, a blanket of dark cotton. I craned my neck and was met with nothing but silent gloom. The woods were quiet, the usual chorus of birds and bugs absent. I could hear my heart hammering in my chest, a rush of beating blood in my ears. I looked to my left, scanning the tree line, and suddenly felt sick as my eyes focused on the scene before me, a deep fear sparking in my chest. The forest was ripped in half, leaving a dark corridor of splintered ruin. It looked like a train had exploded through the woods, obliterating everything in its path. Fractured trees and uprooted underbrush spilled out into the clearing, the remains of nature. "What is going on?" I whispered, voice tainted with fear. I suddenly spotted something in the pond, floating on the surface, and as I squinted to try and make out what it was, my eyes went wide and panic foamed in my throat. "No!" I cried, charging towards the water's edge. I splashed into the shadows at full speed, tripping and then pulling myself up. I shoved lily pads aside and sloshed deeper, the horror before me gaining clarity. "Russ," I said, reaching out for his motionless body. The water was up to my waist as I grabbed at him, pulling him up from under. He was dead weight in my arms, his head rolling against my chest as I dragged him toward shore. Come on, Russ," I begged, gritting my teeth, heart racing, muscles groaning. His eyes were closed, and he didn't move. I finally got us onto the grass where we collapsed in a rush of weight and water. I struggled to regain my breath as I got to my knees and flipped Russ over on his back. My heart sank. His face was a mess of cuts and dark bruises. His clothes were a tangled jumble of torn fabric, brushing strands of wet hair from his face. "Who did this to you, Russ?" I felt like I already knew the answer. I shifted myself over him, fighting panic. I placed my hands over his chest and began CPR. "Please, wake up," I begged, pumping his chest. "Please, you have to wake up. Don't do this, Russ, please." I leaned down and blew into his mouth, tears starting to leak from my eyes. I felt helpless, alone, and filled with overwhelming despair. Why did everything always have to go to shit? Why did I always end up making things worse? Why couldn't I escape the never-ending stream of misfortune? "Please," I said, now beating on Russ's chest. "Please, don't do this." Suddenly, in a rush of urgency, the eyes of Russ snapped open, and he vomited up a great gout of pond water. He coughed and sputtered, emptying his stomach as his body convulsed. I leaned back on my knees, unable to believe it. Relief swept over me, a cackle escaping my lips. You're alive," I cried, gripping the shoulder of Russ as he wiped his mouth and lay on his back. Russ kept his eyes shut, his voice terribly weak. Hey, Slick. You just can't seem to stay awake, can you? What happened to you? Why is everything different?" Russ touched his face before answering. He found me with you already gone. And he didn't like that." Who did?" I knew the answer. I jerked my head to the woods, the sound of the drum robbing my attention. "No, not now, please." Russ, broken and defeated, said, He's coming back to finish the job. And if you're here, he's going to get you. The drum was getting loud. I leaned down and grabbed the arm of Russ. What does he want? Why is he doing this? Russ closed one eye and looked painfully at me with the other one. He's not doing this, Jack. You are. My body went cold and I said nothing, with my throat going dry. Suddenly, a long rising whistle rose from the forest, first high, then dipping low. The notes bounced off the dark clouds and echoed across the meadow, filling me with dread. Russ tried to sit up, grasping at my arm. You can't keep doing this, he said, desperation filling his voice. You can't keep coming here like this. He's gonna kill you. My lips trembled and I looked down at Russ. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I put my hands over my face, sobbing. Jesus, what have I done?
Jackie.
The voice cracked through the air like a clap of thunder, and my heart tripped into my rib cage, crippling fear spreading across my chest. Another shrieking whistle, a sharp drill in my ears, boring into my skull. The ground shook beneath my feet, and I suddenly heard the exploding wood and crashing underbrush from the forest. The sound was distant, but approaching the meadow at a tremendous speed. The whistling man, I whispered. I stood up and faced the tree line. Sweat coated my spine with cold fear, and I licked my mouth with my face pale. Don't let him get you, Slick, Russ said from the ground. Tears ran down my cheeks. I closed my eyes as the drum and constant whistle blasted around me. I could hear trees crashing to the earth as the whistling man rocketed towards me from the woods. I felt helpless and terrified, a lone man against a tsunami of power and devastation. The whistling man exploded from the tree line and into the meadow. Immediately, everything went silent. My heart counted the seconds against my chest. I squeezed my eyelids shut even tighter. I suddenly felt the presence of someone standing directly in front of me, hot breath on my face. Stars swam around me as the world began to fade. With one last gasp, I whispered, "Please, just let me go home." Right as I was about to pass out, a blackness ate my eyes. The grip around my throat was removed. I gasped and fell to my knees, the metal rushing back into focus, color and clarity, realigned as I coughed and sputtered, clutching my aching throat. I looked up in a relieved confusion, and my eyes went wide. Russ was holding the whistling man from behind, one arm wrapped around his throat in a chokehold. He had his other arm over the whistling man's face with his hand shoved inside his mouth, gripping his upper jaw with commanding strength. Sweat stood out on the face of Russ, his eyes two coals of burning fire. His voice crackled like a blazing furnace. "He doesn't need you anymore. Leave him alone, goddammit." The whistling man growled around Russ's hand, fury shaking him.
I am him.
The neck muscles of Russ strained as he began to pull the whistling man's head backwards, howling with authority. "Not any more." Screaming with exhausted effort, Russ ripped the whistling man's head back between his shoulder blades in an explosion of blood and bone. I heard a sickening pop as his spine shattered, blood gushing from the now lifeless mouth. Gasping, Russ pulled his bloody hand from the whistling man's jaws and shoved the dead man to the ground. He looked at me, chest heaving. "You okay, Slick?" Shock rooted me to the ground, complete disbelief freezing me where I sat. Crying, I got into my feet and embraced him, weeping onto his chest. Russ stroked my hair and let me cry into him, his heart beating against my chest. "Thank you so much," I wept. "I'm so sorry. I'm so fucking sorry for doing this." Russ pulled me away and took me by the shoulders. "You're a lot stronger than you think, Jack. Never forget that." I wiped tears from my face, unable to stop more from coming. "I won't forget. I promise I won't. Thank you so much." Russ nodded. "Now, are you ready to go back?" I nodded, sniffling. Russ closed his eyes. Good luck to you, Slip. I'm proud of you. And with that, he pushed me backwards, and I awoke with a start on the bar floor. Faces were looking down at me, a blur of color and noise. I blinked and then everything rushed into focus. It was the bartender and the two men she had been talking to. Their faces were filled with concern, and I realized they were talking to me. "Hey, you okay?" one of the men asked, getting down on one knee and helping me sit up. Relief washed over me in a suffocating wave as I grit my teeth as my eyes filled with tears. I smiled up at the three of them, my head clear and focused, all traces of a hangover gone. Alright, thank you. I must have slipped in my stool and bumped my head is all. The bartender told me they had heard a crash and looked over to see me lying on the floor, unmoving. She said it had taken them a little bit to wake me, almost to the point of calling an ambulance. I assured them I was okay, climbing to my feet and brushing myself off. My calm demeanor clearly confused them, to the point of not pressing me further. I thanked them for their concern and told them I was going to call a cab and go home. After making sure I was really okay, they told me to take care of myself. That's when I smiled and said, I will. That was 3 years ago. It's been a long, hard road since that night, but I'm doing well. It took months for my wife to get over that horrific act of selfishness, but I have proven to her since then that I will never be that man again. I can't believe she didn't leave me, and it fills me with eternal gratitude. I spent this time proving to my family that they can rely on me. I have shown them my resolve, and we've grown closer, making it through these horrible early months. But we're stronger now, and life has begun to show promise of happiness. I did end up losing my job, but my boss was able to secure me another with a sister company. It was an act of kindness that I wasn't expecting, and it furthered me down the path to positivity. It's taken 3 long years to rebuild my life, and it's been 3 years since I had a drink. I'm not gonna lie to you and tell you it was easy, because it wasn't. It was hard, impossibly hard, even after everything I went through. There were days I almost gave in to temptation, but I would open up to my wife during those times of weakness, and she helped me through them. She gave me hope that I could change, but I had to face what I had become first, and I will never go back to being that man. I'll find my own way to the meadow. I know it's out there, waiting for me, the path to its peaceful serenity, growing more clear the longer I walk the road of recovery. And even though I come so far and made so much progress, I'm still filled with fear, because I know he's out there, waiting for me. He'll always be there, the whistling man. I remember when I was 12 or so, and my dad had shot a deer right behind the shoulder, but it managed to get away, so we had to go track it. It was around mid-November, and it was starting to get dark. So I had my SKS, which I had been killing deer with since I was young. I also had a flashlight with me. Being crafty, my dad put me in this valley where we found a pretty good pool of it, and I sat on top of a boulder just to mark the spot while he took my brother and put him further out past the tree line. There were tons of rocks and boulders all over the place, so I got up on a boulder that had a pretty good viewpoint. It also had a decent clearing of about 50 to 75 yards around me. Well, the night started to set in, and it was about 50 or so degrees, eventually dropping even more. I was in the middle of this clearing with a light overcast and a full moon. I remember clicking the light off to save the battery and letting my eyes adjust to my surroundings. Seeing the pitch blackness compared to the moonlit valley that was pretty clear. Just about 30 or 40 minutes after my brother and my dad left me, I remember hearing some coyotes and seeing them on the outskirts of the clearing. However, they weren't circling. They paused for a bit to look, and when they continued on, I sat quietly on the boulder, watching nature go by, with the wind picking up slowly, giving a gentle strobing effect with the cloud overcast, just switching with light to no light. I heard the coyotes yip and howl a few times, and then they started to fade away. Minutes after that, I heard a resounding shot and a report of impact like a boom. I figured that they either found the deer and put it down, or someone shot a coyote. Around that time, I heard a scream, which actually got me worried. Then just silence. The wind stopped howling. The pine tree stopped rustling. I couldn't hear any of the coyotes in the distance again. Just dead silence. After a bit, I started hearing some light sounds on my right, almost like rocks banging together. About 75 yards of the clearing, I saw a few rocks rolling down the side. I watched them when they first came into view, bouncing along, tumbling. Then, I just listened as the clouds blacked out in the clearing. Then I watched them again come to a complete stop after a bit. I got real low on the boulder with my SKS, ready, aiming at the point of the sound. A few more rocks did the same thing from the same spot. And that's when I saw a dark outline through the trees. Not quite in the clearing, but rather a few yards deep in the trees. I saw a pair of antlers when the light picked it back up, and then it went dark. I could hear some heavy breathing along the edge of the clearing. I was starting to think it was an injured deer. I keyed the radio that we all had 3 times to signal distress so that my dad and brother would come back. I turned the volume really low, and I sat quietly on the rock, making sure not to silhouette myself as I peered into the darkness with my scope, trying to get a good picture. I remember seeing the outline somewhat upright in the light, like it was a buck that stretched his neck out. Then it would get dark, and then nothing. I did panic a bit despite just being 12, knowing the hoofs of a deer should clack pretty loud if they moved at all, especially if it was that quiet. So I sat and waited, not moving a muscle as that pool of blood next to me seemed to lazily waft itself into my nose. It wasn't overpowering or anything, but it cut in pretty strong as I scanned again when the clouds cleared up for a few moments, looking for anywhere that this thing could have gone. My radio keyed back twice, meaning somebody wanted to talk. I keyed 3 times again, and I saw lights over on my left shoulder where my dad and brother went down to track after the buck. Still a few hundred yards or so off in the distance, I sat there alone, jittering quietly in the cold, with a lingering hope that my dad and brother would catch up. The light went out again, and I could hear those rocks rolling just a bit from a spot just a little further up the hill. But a few yards closer, the rocks rolled into vision when the cloud passed. I could see a dark figure again with some antlers, 60-something yards away, with a few trees in between. Knowing where my brother and dad were, I leveled out the rifle and I started to wait for a clear shot. I stepped out, and I was a hair away from the trigger falling when it went dark. So I waited patiently for the moon to come out again. When it did, whatever was out there had disappeared. It didn't take much sense considering that it was behind a few trees with some considerable openings to each side. I scanned again in the same direction when the wind picked back up, and the tree started to move, with the hillside coming alive again. I heard the footsteps of my family behind me, around 90 yards out, and I slowly crept off the boulder to go meet them, keeping that rifle close to me the whole time. When we met, my brother started giving me crap about how I was screaming and crying about being all alone, being the good brother that he is, when I told him that I hadn't made a sound. They raised their eyebrows and started claiming that I was full of BS. I asked about the shot that I heard, and apparently it was a ways off in the next property over. Since we were on the property line, they found a pretty good blood trail that left the original spot of where I was in just about a straight line all the way to some crushed brush, and about 400 yards out. Having this deer bleed that much this whole time was somewhat unreal. Then, after the trail ended, they moved around a few thousand yards or so just to scan the area where they heard the shot, and it sounded like it was over the low fenced line. I told them about seeing what I could describe as a deer, but I didn't say much on the subject, except that it left without me getting a good look at it. We hiked back up the hill in a staggered column, with my brother picking up the rear with his firearm, and with my dad leading. We made our way back to the truck. When we got there, my brother Cody and I hopped in the bed of the truck, with him overlooking the cabin and me looking over the tailgates. And we started our way down a pretty long trail to the camp house. After a mile or so, we had to take a detour through the brush because a few trees had collapsed on the trail. So we started going around through some clearings in the Dodge. Just before we got back onto the trail, it got real tight with the trees, and we had to get ahead and walk in front of the truck to make sure it could fit. After getting everything cleared out, we assumed the same spots on the truck, and just when we're about to get back to the road, that's when I spotted another pair of different antlers nestled between the brush. At that moment, I hollered to my dad, who was with his windows rolled down. He took out his 1911 at the center console, dropping it on the spot. It turns out that this was the deer he was looking for, but it ended up a few miles down the path with a hard shot, which is pretty impossible. It looked like it had a good gouge on it, just a bit between the point of impact on the ribs, like it had fallen on punji sticks or something. There was no blood trail anywhere near, just that deer standing between two bushes by itself. We did load it up in the back of the truck, and I sat on top of it with my SKS pointed at its head for the rest of the night. Everything went according to plan after that. We ended up skinning the deer up and iced the meat. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Over the next 8 years or so, my brother and I would still hear some screams whenever we would go hunting at night. There shouldn't be any people around for the next 10 or so miles. I forgot to mention that there are all kinds of burial grounds and stuff like that on the land. We found many piles of old arrowheads, Victorian era utensils, and some old burned down houses that had been there since the settlement of Texas. I told my sister about what happened, with her being the oldest of the kids, and she started joking about it being a Wendigo, as the Native Americans would call it, but I'm not so sure it's a joke out there. I never did have another encounter like that, but there were always certain things on that land that would creep me the fuck out. We would find an old stone building with just piles of skulls of animals stacked to the ceiling. So if you ever visit Texas, be mindful of the roads that you come across. Or if you're familiar with Texas, then you know that there are some country roads that go on for hours with nothing in sight. There are some lands that contain some things that are creepy and evil.
I live deep in the mountains and my hollow is surrounded by woods. There is a little spot you can walk to in the woods which is just a giant circle with trees open all around it. Me and my friend went to have a picnic there that day and we started to hear what sounded like a flute. It was really loud coming from the direction where no house is there. Mind you, all my neighbors were old, and I can guarantee you that none of them spent their time walking deep in the woods to play the flute. We heard this for hours, and we left about 8 o'clock that night. And when we started walking back, you could hear it somewhat across the valley. I didn't hear it again for a good 2 years after. However, one night, I woke up at 3 a.m., and my bed was right next to the window, and I had it cracked to let some fresh air in while I was sleeping. I woke up to the sound coming right outside my window, and I was scared to look out to see what it was. It went on for about an hour before it stopped playing, and I never did hear it again. I did talk to a few friends about this, and one of them said to not worry about anything. It's most likely a native spirit that has enjoyed the positive energy me and my friends brought to the forest, and it decided to check in on me down the road. Now that I think about it, it didn't feel evil. The only time it did worry me was waking up to it outside my window. I also done some research, and apparently if there's water nearby, you'll also hear drums. Other beliefs, like if you hear it during the night, it's a bad omen, but if you hear it during the day, it should be something good. However, there's also been stories about people gone missing in the woods after hearing flute-like sounds, or that there's something that wants you to go look and follow it, and it might not be good, especially at 3 a.m. in the morning. I'm sure there's some truth to these beliefs, and the true meaning behind it has been twisted and distorted by now, as it's been passed on through different people. If anybody knows a medicine man or a true native person, would you mind asking them for me and letting me know?
I live in Idaho, about 5 miles from a res. Growing up, we heard all sorts of stories and legends surrounding the reservation. I have to admit, I didn't really believe when it came to the things we heard. My best friend and I have always been drawn to the paranormal. Back when we were about 16 or 17, we decided we would go for drives on the res at night. I know one of the rules of the res is to never go out at night, but again, I didn't really believe in these things. So anyways, the area that we live in has a very close community, and our little town has just over 10,000 people. We basically have no crime, and everyone feels pretty safe. So driving around at night is no big deal. So we would go on these drives fairly often, with no experiences to note. But one day, we heard a story from someone at school about an abandoned schoolhouse on the other side of the res. Just passing the schoolhouse, there was a small bridge that went over a large farming canal. The story was if you drove to the bridge and turned your vehicle off, you could hear water babies. If you don't know what water babies are, there are many different stories and legends coming from Native American culture. I would advise you to go look them up. I mean, don't tell me you thought Skinwalkers was the only paranormal thing around Native American culture. So anyways, we decided that was going to be our next driving destination. None of us had ever heard a water baby cry, so of course we were interested. That night, after dark, we jumped in my car and started driving out there. The closer we got to the schoolhouse, I did start to feel a little bit uneasy. We drove past the building that was supposedly the schoolhouse and stopped on the bridge. I cut the lights and killed the engine. Silence. There was no sound, except for the rushing water below the bridge. We sat there for what felt like forever, but only about 4 or 5 minutes had gone by. We heard nothing but the water, and so of course we started joking about the story being fake, and decided that it was a bust, and to just go home now. The keys were still in the ignition, so I started the car, but nothing. The dash lights lit up, but it just wouldn't turn over. I never had any issues with my car before this. I tried a couple of more times while talking with my friend, not wanting to freak her out. But after the third time of trying to start it up, I turned to her and said, "I don't want to freak you out or anything, but my car won't start." Her eyes grew wide and she responded with, "Tell me you're joking." I wish I had been. We sat there for a minute just staring at each other, not knowing what to do. If we called my mom, there would definitely be some ass chewing for being out on the res so late, especially at night. So instead, we chose to call one of our friends that had a truck. If the battery was just dead, he could give us a jump. If not, he could tow us back to town. So we called and waited, sitting in the middle of the bridge in my dead car, frustrated from the lack of experience and car troubles. We just wanted to go home now. But that's when I saw it. It's a well-known fact that the reservation has packs of wild dogs that roam around killing livestock, and there have been a few instances of them attacking kids and even putting them in the hospital. But this was no dog. I've seen all types of wolves and coyotes, but there was no way in hell this thing was either of those. It was skeletal, like a malnutrition animal, and it was walking on all fours, slow and low to the ground. It was walking along the canal towards the bridge. I smacked my friend, making her turn to look and see what I was staring at. We both stare in disbelief at this creature, slowly coming towards us. I honked the horn. At least that was still working. But this is where things got really weird. This thing stood up on two legs, arms limping at its sides. I kid you not, I fucking screamed. I had never seen anything like this in my whole life. It stood between 8 and 9 feet tall and was staring right at us. It then took a couple more steps towards us. Me and my friend were frozen. We were trapped in my car that wouldn't even start. As it slowly started walking and getting closer, that's when headlights appeared in the distance. As the lights came closer, the creature dropped back to all fours and took off for the hills, where I assume it came from. Our friend pulled up to help us, and both my creeped out friend and I kept quiet about what we just saw. He walked up to the car, and I rolled my window down. He suggested that we push the car off the bridge to the side of the road and pop the hood. So I threw it in neutral and got it to the side of the road. My friend asked me to pop the hood and try to start the car. So I did. The damn car started right up. I don't even know what caused it to not start before. But that night, I had an experience I'll never forget. I don't go out on the res anymore at night. I learned my lesson, and I would rather not see whatever it was that night, that creature, again. This happened in 2011, towards the end of October. And yes, it's technically an airsoft story, but it's definitely not what you're thinking. I play on a pretty good airsoft team, and we go to a few regionals and some national events just for fun. It's a good hobby. We don't think we're super elite Navy SEAL operators or anything like that, but we have been to military simulation games before. So I live in a mountain state in the western US, and there are lots of military bases out there. There's a camp in the border state that uses airsoft players to fill the opposing force role for special forces who come to train at the base. When the special force guys, the camp will contact local or regional airsoft teams that have a reputation for winning their tournaments to come out and be the opposing team for the special forces. It's just so that they can get in some training against people that they aren't familiar with, which is mostly CQB, close quarter battles, and also MOUT, military operations in urban terrain. They obviously do a lot more special training than this, but this is just what we're involved in. And these places are about tens of thousands of acres. The reason that I'm explaining all this is because usually mentioning that my hobby is airsoft gets me called names, but whatever. And I promise, the story does get interesting and weird, but I just wanted to explain the background. Anyways, I'll get to the point. Our team went out to the camp for 3 days of MOUT. We played the first and second day on a small MOUT site that they had actually set up. That night, we had just finished dinner when a special forces guy comes over and tells us that they got the call of a missing NG, National Guard, over the radio. We walk over and had a quick briefing with about 100 other guys. A few of them were airsofters and the rest being military. The commander of the camp told us that we were all being sent on a search and rescue to find the missing guardsman. His team was doing a landing exercise that day, and he hadn't reported in by 1800 hours, which is when the training was over. We got set up with National Guard radios, and all got the same channel with the military guys. We gathered what little survival gear that we brought. We grabbed plenty of flashlights with extra batteries. We put on heavy winter coats and caps with warm socks. The temperature was expected to drop to 8 degrees that night. After a 20-minute or so walk, we got to the lost guy's last location. Well, according to where he was supposed to be at. About a dozen guys were already there, and they told us to head up over a hill to our left, and then follow a ravine up north. Another 20 minutes went by, and we started heading up the ravine. Like I mentioned earlier, it was late October, so there were no leaves on the trees, except for pine needles, but obviously, those aren't leaves. We walked a few more minutes in the ravine, then hiked up a hill on a small dirt path, until we came to a crest on the ridge. It was too dark to see anything below us in front, and our flashlights weren't powerful enough to be used past about 150 feet, so we switched to our tack lights on our guns. I've been in the forest during the fall and winter months plenty of times, but this forest in front of us really creeped me out for some reason. All the trees were dead, but also very clustered, so it was difficult to see through them. On both sides, there were small cliffs with pines which blocked any moonlight, and made the stand of trees that much darker. I could tell that a few other guys on our team were a little nervous too, but the fact that there were 7 of us total was some kind of consolation to this. The squad leader said that we were going to go through it because walking on the ridges would be too dangerous in the dark, so we walked about 50 yards down to the edge of the forest. At that point, we radioed back to command to let them know where we were and that we were heading into the forest. We also got on the main channel and let everyone else know too. Then, we slipped into the dense forest, single file, and kept on hiking. We kept in contact by repeating our names every minute or so. This was especially important to keep track of our last man and make sure that nobody got lost. So about 200 yards into this dense forest, we start hearing crackling and rustling noises. This was at our 11 o'clock. We start calling out the name of the missing guy, but we get no response. We radio everyone to let them know what was going on. At that point, we hung a couple of lights on the trees to mark our last position, in case anyone else came through, and then we just continued. We had only gone about another mile when we started to hear very loud screaming coming from straight ahead. It was about 100 yards away. We all took a knee along either side of our path and stayed as quiet as possible. The screams then stopped, and after about 4 minutes of silence, we were almost ready to move on when suddenly the screaming started again. But this time, it was coming around from 10 o'clock. After a few seconds, our team leader turned around to say something, but the screaming started again. But this time, at our 2 o'clock. We all perked up at that point, and soon there were a few screams coming from everywhere from our 10 to our 2 o'clock. We figured that it had to be some kind of animal because there was no one else out there, and there was only one guy that was missing. So we kept advancing, and the screams still continued, still from the same directions, as we kept moving ahead. After about 150 yards, we thought that we would be right in the center of whatever was screaming, but it was still coming from in front of us. The squad leader stopped, turned, and told us he heard running water up ahead. After a few more feet, we came to a small stream. We crossed carefully on some stones and then moved another 200 feet or so, until we came to a sunken area in the forest, where there was a 20-foot gap clearing between the trees. We stopped for a minute, got some rounds together, then decided to try to catch the animals off guard, but it wasn't getting louder or even more quiet, even though we kept moving. We all lined up and turned on the lights at the same time. We were aiming straight ahead. The screaming then stopped, out of nowhere. All I could see was the row of gray dead trees in front of us, and pure darkness right behind them. The hair on my arms was completely raised at that point, because whatever had been screaming now knew that we were there. Once we turned on the lights, we were about to shift positions and move into better cover when we heard an extremely loud roar come from our front. I heard bears, mountain lions, and other wilderness critters before, but this was like nothing that I had ever heard in my life. It definitely wasn't human, and it wasn't any recognizable animal. Some of the guys started to whisper, but soon stopped as this other noise came from behind us. And in a few seconds, what sounded like roars and screeches were coming from all around us. And suddenly, we heard one come from our 8 o'clock that sounded like it was only a few fucking feet away. It was at this point that our squad leader got up on one knee and said, "Everybody get up, we're moving right now." In an urgent, non-screwing around voice, we all stood up and quickly started sprinting towards our 1 o'clock, the opposite direction of the closest roar. I don't even remember how long we ran, only jumping over logs and trying not to get caught on the branches. I would shine my light to the left through the trees for a couple of seconds, and then switch back to the path to see where I was going. These screeches kept coming from both sides and seemed to close in on us. Lucky for me, I never saw anything with my light when I was running. I mean, I didn't want to see, but at the same time, it was almost worse not knowing what was chasing us. We finally reached the riverbank, and all of us literally leaped about 12 feet across, because that's how much the adrenaline was pumping through us. When we landed on the other side, we scrambled up a hill with some pines and hid behind the trees. Even though we were only a few feet from each other, we kept our lights scanning the tree line below us. My adrenaline was really going at that point, and my body felt like it was about 1/10 the weight that it actually was. That was the most intense fight or flight moment in my life. I was able to keep my arm steady and my light pointed below us. After a couple of minutes, I realized that something was rattling heavy to my left. I checked over my shoulder and saw my teammate shaking so hard that his gear was rattling around like all hell on his body. I shifted my position and put my hand on his shoulder, but he immediately jerked his arm so hard, my hand went flying. I looked right into his eyes, and I have never seen that much fear in my entire life. His pupils were dilated so much that I almost couldn't see the whites of his eyes. I told him that we put some distance between ourselves and whatever was chasing us, and that we're gonna be okay. Lucky he hadn't totally lost it yet, and he nods to acknowledge what I said. We sit up on the hill for about 10 full minutes just trying to get our shit together, and also let the adrenaline go down. Finally, I scoot over to the squad leader and ask for his radio. He fumbles for a minute, then he hands it to me with a shaking hand. I'm pretty sure, or at least I felt like the most level-headed one in our team right now. So I called on the radio to let the other teams know what was happening. It took about 2 minutes of uninterrupted talking on the radio to explain our situation, because my mouth was also starting to shake, and I had to repeat and correct myself every 2 seconds. Soon, there was radio traffic reporting the exact same type of thing happening with other squads. This made us feel slightly relieved, until we realized that whatever was screeching wasn't just isolated to the one area. At that point, we decided to get the fuck out of the area and stay on the ridges where at least we had some visibility below us, and we weren't surrounded by a dense grove of trees. We walked about half a mile along the ridge, then we had to drop down onto a dirt path because the hilltop was too steep to continue. After some more walking, we came to a small cluster of the same dead trees. Even though we were on the opposite side of the hill where we were chased, we were still on the edge though, and slowly approached the trees with our lights off and with no communication. When we were about 25 feet away, we saw some movement and froze in place. My adrenaline had kicked in again, and I thought, this is it, no more running, It's gonna get us right here, in the middle of nowhere. And no one, not my family, not my friends, will ever know what happened to me. Before I had the chance to swing my light up, 4 lights beamed in our direction. Search and rescue team. It took us a few seconds. The guys in the trees pointed their lights down and told us to come towards them. I thought my team was scared to death, but these 4 guys were as white as sheets. They asked if we heard the same noises and the screeching as well, and we replied yes. And then we also mentioned we had been chased a few minutes earlier. They said the exact same thing happened to them, only they had stayed in place and had been stalked, circled, until they heard us approaching a few hundred feet away. After we linked up with the 4 new guys, we got the fuck out of there and continued north, hoping to find some other squads just to at least increase our numbers and feel a little bit safer. After about 5 minutes into the walk, I heard a loud thump behind me, and everyone immediately turned around, expecting to see whatever had been screaming. We saw a man, laying down on his stomach but still moving. We all thought he was attacked, but he got up onto his knees and started slapping his chest, indicating that he had the wind knocked out of him. All he did was point down to his right. As we looked closer, we saw a piece of rebar where his foot was, and there was some concrete right under it. We all got around him, and someone helped him up, and the 2 squad leaders decided to check the area to our 4 o'clock. We only fanned out a few feet, but within a few minutes, we had found a small clearing with large cement squares in the middle. There were some metal railings blocking off the center of the cement, and the middle line was bisecting the center of it all. That's when we realized that we are looking at a nuclear silo, placed out in the middle of fucking nowhere. A few of the guys started talking about how we could just take shelter inside the silo, but most of the others were quick to say no, and it's too dangerous and will waste time. Still, a few people found the entrance. It's basically like a manhole, and they pulled off the cover. We start going over a couple of guys at a time to check it out. When I go over there, I shine my light down through the hole and circled around to get a better angle. I can see there's a ladder that goes down quite a few ways, but it's not until I stepped up to the edge of the hole that I can see the ladder goes down about 50 feet into pitch blackness, and there are several levels below it too. I started to get chills just looking down there, but it made me feel very uneasy. It's very hard to explain. It almost felt like there was something down there, staring back at us from the darkness. I stepped away and sat down on the railing with a guy from our search team. I could see he was still shaking slightly, and I looked at his face, and I saw tears. He was crying a little bit too. He was only 16, one of the younger players on the team. I told him that it was going to be alright, and then I took a deep breath and let it out slowly. I told him to copy me. We then started breathing in unison for a couple of minutes, which definitely helped the both of us out. Because to be honest, and I hate to admit it, but I was starting to lose my shit as well. After we came to the conclusion that none of us were going to go down into the silo, a couple of guys yelled down inside just to be sure that somehow, for some reason, that the missing man wasn't in there. We all knew that he wasn't, but we wanted to reassure ourselves that we were doing our best to find him, since everything else was going to shit. I had almost forgot about our search mission, with everything else that was going on around us. It was only about a minute that passed until I heard the radio chatter again. This time, it was about calling off the search because of adverse conditions. The squad leader said that we needed to move 1.5 miles southeast to meet up with some Hummers that were gonna come get us. We collected all of our shit and got moving quickly. We moved in pairs and numbered off so we didn't lose anybody. Basically, we kept repeating our numbers up the line. 9 and 10 up, 11 up, 7 and 8 up, 5 and 6 up, and once we got to 1 and 2, we started to the back of the line again. Another couple of minutes, and the trees started getting way too close together again. So tight that we had to slow down and slip single file between the branches and trunks. Right after we had all squeezed through, that's when we heard a piercing, shrieking sound, which was immediately followed by the most blood-curdling roar we had heard yet, and it echoed 3 times in the dense forest. and that's when we went into serious panic mode. We flat out sprinted the rest of the distance, about 1 mile, while yelling out our individual numbers occasionally. There were 5 grown men, and out of the 11, the rest were all over 16. I didn't hear a single voice the whole time that didn't sound panicked and terrified. I could hear the urgency in everyone as we were running. I started to get lightheaded from running 3/4 of a mile, but somehow I was able to keep going until they heard a loud thump behind me, and then what sounded like a dog growling. I yelled for my running buddy to come back, then looked behind me and saw the last guy in line, number 11, slowly running over on the ground. We both ran over, scooped him up under his arms, and got him to his feet. This is it. This was the moment that I looked up and caught something, a quick flash of whatever was following us. I can't describe what I saw. It was only a shadow in the trees about 100 feet away, but it looked so much larger than any animal that I had ever seen. As we turned around, I noticed that an 8-inch thick log that we had jumped over a few seconds earlier was now broken in half on the path, with splinters everywhere. Then, something screeched very loud about 10 feet to our left in the trees next to us. That was our cue to get the fuck out of there. And everything after this happened in frames because I was in flight mode. I remember seeing lights in the distance pointing at us. The whole time he kept saying, "I don't want to be the last one in. Let me get in first. Please, let me get in first. Don't leave me behind. I don't want to be last." I never heard that much panic in anyone's voice before, or since then. As we got close to the Hummer, I looked up and saw the gunner, who had swung around the .50 caliber in our direction, and saw fear in his eyes too. And he wasn't even one of the guys on our team. He was a guardsman fully trained, and a grown man at that. He was truly scared. We threw our friend in the back of the third Hummer, then number 10 climbed in. I almost hopped about 4 feet into the cargo area. That's when I heard the gunner call out, "Contact 3 o'clock," and ask if he could engage, but the vehicle commander said no and told the driver to step on it and get the fuck out of there. Nobody said a word on the way back to the base. When we got back, the National Guard guys were freaked out, and pretty much everyone else was shaking and didn't respond to questions right away. I don't know what the hell it was that we saw out there, but it wasn't a bear or a mountain lion. And even the military guys had seen it because they called out contacts and were ready to engage with whatever it was. I've been having goosebumps the entire time that I've been typing this up because of the memories. I haven't told this story before, until now. It happened at a very large military camp base in Wyoming in 2011. Apparently, they never did find the National Guard guy who was lost, even when they sent out helicopters with front-facing thermal cameras, or whatever they are. And that's basically it. They never did find the guy. The command staff sent trained search and rescue teams over the next few weeks, and everyone who was out looking got debriefed with basically, "Don't ever talk about anything that happened out there." We all drove back home after that. It took most of us weeks to get over the experience, if we ever did. It was something that stayed with us, haunting our dreams for a long time. After returning home, I tried to resume my normal life, but the events of that night continued to weigh heavy on my mind. I found it very difficult to sleep, plagued by nightmares of being pursued through the dark woods by something. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had chased us was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. I did reach out to some squad mates, hoping that talking about our shared experience would provide some relief. It helped to know that I wasn't alone in my fear and confusion, but it didn't make the memories any less terrifying. In the weeks and months that followed, I became obsessed with trying to understand what happened that night. I searched the internet for any information that might shed some light on what we possibly came across, but I found nothing but conspiracy theories. Eventually, I came to accept that I will never fully understand what happened out there. So before I start this story, I would like to say that the Black Hills is sacred land. It's a deeply spiritual place. As a Native American, I was told by my relatives and grandparents that the mountains were sacred places and that spirits dwell within them. Back in the early days, our ancestors would ask for permission and safe passage before traveling through them. On the Siksika First Nation here in Canada, in the center of the reservation sits a patch of land that's been sacred to the Blackfoot for hundreds of years. They call it the Sandhills. My wife once joined her father, a medicine man, to collect these pine berries that grow on the ground. I forgot the exact plant name. For beading purposes. She had trouble finding some and told her dad. Her dad looked at her with a confused look and said, "Well, did you ask him if you could take them?" Realizing her mistake, she bowed her head and asked. She then went down to look again, and of course, found an abundance of these berries. It's believed that these people, the tobacco people, live in the sandhills. Tiny people, and when you take something from the sandhills, you have to leave tobacco behind as an offering. So my wife's late uncle once told me a story before the res had street lights, that they would often have to walk from one community to the other to attend gatherings such as dances. They would have to walk on this long stretch of gravel to get to the other community, and to the west of this road were the sandhills, and they would see silhouettes dancing in the sandhills. So I went on a camping trip and ended up camping in the Black Hills National Forest in South Dakota. Besides the warning of bad weather and a general uneasy feeling going in, I assumed I was just anxious from driving all day and the fact that I haven't tent camped without a group in years. I know about the outdoors and I trust in myself, but I'm extremely respectful to the land, especially the forest, as I'm normally picking up garbage and disposing of waste whenever I found it. Me and my wife finally arrived to the site. It's last minute and we decided to camp not too far off a dirt road, in a designated camping spot with a tent and blankets in my truck. We set up the tent and watched the sunset before falling asleep in the tent. I have the feeling to leave my firearm locked up in my truck for some reason, and I decided to listen to my gut. This time, we crawled into bed and drifted off to the sound of rain in the forest. I knew it was the anniversary of the Deadwood flood, but I don't pay too much mind to it. I'm having a little bit of trouble falling deeply asleep, as I'm just listening to the noises all around the tent. I'm not sure how it happened, but I guess I fell asleep, because I woke up to the sound of the tent zipper being opened. I'm not sure what time it was, but I sat straight up, and that's when I saw a face of pure black, staring at me in the darkness, with a massive grin on its face. All I can make out is eyes and a smile. I'm frozen in fear and blink a couple of times to find it gone. My wife, who was laying next to me, is asking me if I'm okay, and I just say it was a nightmare, but I was okay and not to worry about me, and to go back to bed. She falls back asleep, and I just lay there, frozen in shock for a few hours. I had crazy dreams before, but nothing like this. It was too real, and it was too vivid to be a dream. This is actually the first time my wife goes camping, so I decided not to tell her in fear of scaring her away from something we both discover and we enjoy. I did teach my wife to leave everything better than how you found it, in this case before we arrived, and to be respectful and responsible of nature itself. So anyways, I haven't paid much mind to it until tonight, after talking about it with my roommate. I'm taking this experience more as a warning than an actual threat. I had spiritual encounters a few times in my life, all of which are very positive, and they guide me, but this was different. This pure black face that was poking its head inside a tent didn't speak a single word. and I was actually scared for the first time. We did end up leaving in a hurry with the excuse of getting on the road. I'm still very scared. I'm mostly seeking guidance about this situation with family members and to get opinions on what this could be. I'm not sure what it was, but I will let you all know. So this happened a few years ago in Vermont, a place that me and my friends go to almost every other weekend. My friend's uncle owns about 140 acres of land. We go camping there all the time. We used to go with him, but now that we're a little bit older, it's just been us for quite a long time. One of the times we actually have a group of friends go. It's unusual because they're not really into camping or doing stuff in the woods, but it was still pretty cool to chill with them all out there. When his uncle bought the land, there was a busted up camper that was parked there, and we would shoot at it just for fun. It was actually pretty useful though, because me and my friends who would go up a lot would cut up some extra firewood and just leave it in the trailer, so we would have some dry wood for winter trips. The first night was great. It was super fun. I passed out not long after we got there, since we got everything set up around 1 a.m. and settled in around then. The next morning, we do our hikes and stuff, and we're just loving life. Then we get back, and I'm just getting the fire going when I hear, "Guys, what the fuck?" We rush over, and in the camper right in the doorway is a cow's head. It couldn't have been more than a few days old, barely if at all decomposed. There are farms everywhere in Vermont, but the nearest farm from us was easily a 30-minute drive. We are far in the woods here, so we grab our guns and just start to patrol the area a bit. Only me and my main friend have any guns. Everyone is dead silent for a long time. We're all just listening. I convince everyone that however it got there, the person was gone. There was no body, just a head. Me and my friend go for a walk down this usual pathway, and we follow it for about 5 miles. And when you do, you end up at this huge clearing. It's one of those clearings in the woods where all the power lines go through. So we keep on walking. About 15 minutes later down the path, a path that again we know very well by now, we see this big ass tree, and there are stones planted in the ground like steps. We look at each other like, what the hell are those? Because we just took the same trail last month. So we follow the path, and it circles around the tree, and we see a chair on the back side of it. I stare at it for a while. There's nothing strange about the chair, but the stones that are put on the ground. It almost looks like someone, for some reason, was worshipping whatever was in this chair. I then notice that the sun is starting to set, and it's gonna get pretty dark soon. My friend then says that he's starting to feel a little creeped out. It gets dark really quick when you're that deep in the woods. There's no light at all. Then, all of a sudden, we hear the group that we left behind, and they're screaming like bloody murder. So we start running back down the trail, kicking ourselves for not staying with them and looking around. We get back to where the group is at, with our guns up, looking around, calling our friends' names. All of them are around the camper, a little out of our sight, still looking ahead. They all get scared as hell because it looks like we're getting ready to shoot them. We ask if they're alright. We heard them scream. The look of dread on their faces is something I'll never forget. They were looking all pale, and all of them said that nobody was screaming. They said they didn't even hear anything. Me and my friend explained that we heard what sounded like a group of people getting killed, screaming. Finally, my friend decides that he's gonna go up to his uncle's cabin, which is about 80 acres away, and tells him what happened. So his uncle comes back to the campsite, and he sees the cow head. He looks at us and says that he's not screwing around or playing games, and he starts saying that we could get arrested for doing some sick shit like this, and that he was gonna call the police on us himself if he finds out that we did it. After asking and talking with everybody, he realizes that we aren't lying and that we didn't do it. Either way, the police get called. They see the cow head, They see the chair, but they're not really interested in it. I tell them about the screams, but they barely pay attention. If anything, they were only concerned with the cow's head. They tell us just to go home and forget about all this. Like, actually go back home, 2.5 hours away. I did forget to mention that this cow head, it was a clean cut. I mean, someone cut this thing's head off, and they did it very good. I have gone hunting before, but I hunt for food. But whenever me and my friend and his uncle go, we save the meat, and his uncle even tends to hide and we make stuff with it. But this was skillfully cut off the thing's body, and there was no blood to be found or the body. We tell the police that we're too far away, and we aren't gonna pack up to just go home right now. They simply tell us that we better leave, with our stuff, or without the stuff, but to just leave. My friend's uncle gets all what the fuck, and he starts sticking up for us. The police then whisper something in his ear, and they both look at us. That's when my uncle's demeanor just completely changes. He tells us to go home, and then him and the cop just walk away, and they continue talking. We were looking at each other confused, and we couldn't hear what they were whispering. But I swear, I heard something along the lines of some sort of cult. But other than that, we're really not wanting to leave right now, but we still do, because we don't want any more trouble than it's worth. My friend then calls his uncle that night when we all get home to tell him that we're okay. There's no answer, and it's really late at night, so we think maybe he's sleeping. He calls back almost every day for the next few weeks, and there's no answer. His uncle has literally avoided him from that day on as much as possible. He acts like he doesn't even exist at this point, and there was even a time when they were all together at a family barbecue, and he was always so happy and always joking. But now, he just pretends that he doesn't exist. He doesn't even associate with anybody, and he just kinda always looks sad, always by himself. I don't know what the hell was going on in those woods that night. I think about it all the time, and it's something that I'll never forget. This is a true story. I'll return to the spot at some point this summer and take some photos to add for reference. I've been sitting with the story for many years now, and it's not that exciting and scary as most of the stories that you might listen to, but it is creepy and eerie, and I wanted to see if anyone could give me an idea of what possibly happened. So my family, well actually my aunt, has owned a large piece of land, over 100 acres, in Connecticut for many years now. Her property is located in a state park that is mostly uninhabited and only visited by backpackers. Her land is well off of any main roads, and we have to drive through a lot of forest to reach her house. She bought the land and remodeled the old house that was already built on it so that it was more livable. And going up to visit her has always been my favorite thing to do. I have been going every year since I was a baby, and I have also spent many hours exploring the woods, the creeks, and the land around the house. We call it the farm, even though it's not a true farm itself. She does have some small horses, donkeys, and back in the day some other animals. The animals are on one side of the property, the area that has been cleared out for them to graze, get fat, and be happy. The rest of the farm is untouched woodlands. She decided to install 12-foot fencing around the property, even though it only encloses about 80 acres of the land that she owns. She explained to me that she couldn't stand the sounds of the coyotes right outside her window at night, and that she also had some creepy encounters while living there. She didn't go into the details of these at that time, since I was a young child. She does live alone, so I understand why she wanted to feel a semblance of security in those deep woods. We are originally from down south, so being in this type of environment was new to all of us. Anyways, despite being unfamiliar with the land, I eventually learned to navigate the area very well as a kid. I had a few favorite spots, and one was up a small foothill in the deepest part of the woods. I would go up so often that eventually a small path was established in the brush, and I would bring my cousins with me to show them my little hiding spot. In 2008, when I was about 10 years old, I took a summer trip to my aunt's and brought my best friend Alex with me. She and I often took trips here together during our childhood, and this was not her first time joining me to the farm. I remember we were in the woods at my favorite spot, sitting together and listening to Katy Perry, while playing Doodle Jump on our new iPod Touches. This actually makes me laugh to remember, but we were just trying to enjoy some nature while getting our fill of new tech, I guess. We were there for a while enjoying ourselves and talking about random kid stuff, when suddenly there was this change in the air. Almost like a suffocating stillness and silence came upon us in the woods. I paused the music and looked to Alex, who was already staring at me with a worried expression on her face. We stayed still and silent for a minute, looking around, listening to the woods and searching out for any familiar sounds that normally echoed throughout the day and night across the farm. But there were no birds, no summer bugs, and the trees almost seemed to stand frozen in place. It's like if the wind that normally rustled their leaves also left us completely. It was a terrible feeling, and I knew Alex was feeling it too. That's when we heard the sound of footsteps coming from even deeper in the woods. It took a moment for me to figure out what the sound was, but the rhythm of weight being picked up and put down on leaves and brush was impossible not to notice. It was bipedal and heavy, and it was coming up towards us from a steep slope down the side of the mountain. I remember thinking it was impossible for a human to move so easily through that part of the woods, since it was very thick with fallen branches and trees and rocks, even making it hard for a small kid to navigate, let alone a normal grown-up person. It felt as if the woods were laying still, waiting for the footsteps making their way swiftly up the steep incline towards us. "Do you hear that?" I asked Alex in a whisper, and she nodded. "It sounds like footsteps," I continued, and she nodded again, looking like she was about to burst into tears. I took her hand and began running down the makeshift path with her, trying not to fall or let her lag behind me at all. We did not stop until we reached the house. I don't think we told anyone that day, because we were just too shaken to even understand what might have been out there. The next day I asked Alex if she would go back to the spot with me. She did hesitate for a minute at first, but eventually agreed and said we could go look for signs of another human. We made our way back, nervous, but determined to discover what had invaded our little spot. When we reached the spot, I looked down towards the direction when we heard the footsteps. I think I even slid down a little bit to investigate in the brush and leaves. I didn't go too far because I was about to lose my nerve, and I hadn't noticed much anyway. So I quickly climbed back up to where Alex was waiting for me. We decided that it must have been some sort of animal, despite every logical explanation indicating otherwise. I knew what deer sounded like, and that was not a deer, but I wanted to forget and have fun again. We took our iPods out and began the same ritual of relaxing and playing games while chatting about nonsense. It seemed like things were back in their natural state again, so we quickly forgot about the terrifying experience and let our naive childlike wonder take over. After a little while, that's when the stillness returned, and it happened so quickly. This time, the footsteps started immediately. They were loud and coming from a different direction. The best way I can explain the location is that it was in a similar spot to the day before, but somewhat more to the right, where the forest was very dark and the incline to reach us was less steep. I didn't want to wait too long to run, but it was long enough to realize that the sound was faster, closer, and definitely not a fucking deer or a bear. I didn't look into the woods too closely because I wanted to get the fuck out of there, and was even too scared to see whatever it was. I knew it was close enough that it would be upon us at any moment if we didn't start running, so without saying anything, Alex and I took off and ran as fast as possible out of those woods. It's not a super exciting story, but that's my first creepy experience in the woods. I have since had more, as I'm now a backpacker and love the outdoors, but the experiences back in that farm have always been the most bizarre. If anyone has any ideas about what the fuck this was, please let me know. I think about it every time I go into any woods. By the way, the area that we were in is pretty far away from the main house and also any other civilization. We did ask my aunt if there was any men on the property, and she said no. She also confirmed that the gates were always working, even though it wouldn't be hard for a bear to breach them or for a fox to dig underneath them. If anybody has any ideas, let me know.
As a native man myself, I can tell you there's a bunch of native paranormal stories that you have no clue about. Most people only know about skinwalkers, but even those themselves, we've seen what the internet and ignorant people do when they take something like this and just spread it around. First of all, a skinwalker is not a creature. They're actually medicine men, but maybe I'll give you some background on that another day. However, the main reason you hear a lot more about skinwalkers than anything else is because some of us don't have the same access to the internet as others in the rest do, simply because of the city internet companies. The companies tax the shit out of the internet, so it's not even worth it most of the time, unless you have a great income or quite a few people on the bill. But even if a native person does have internet, they most likely don't use the internet like everybody else does. They don't spend their time on Facebook, Reddit, or even YouTube. However, that's been my experience with family and friends. In our culture, when it comes to these paranormal stories, it's almost stories that have been told verbally, in person. So when someone in our tribe died, unless someone remembered their stories and passed them on, their stories died as well. Now, even if all the stars align, and a native does retell the story, and has access to the internet, has access to all of social media, most natives simply don't want to post their stories, because even their own family and friends don't believe them, even if they have a few witnesses. You know, like most people wouldn't believe a half goat, half man, or little people, water babies, all the different ceremonies and their uses. So instead of risking the quote-unquote explanations and embarrassment, some of us just keep it on the inside until we meet another native that we can trust enough to not be judged, and so we exchange stories without a worry, cause, you know, they seen similar things on their reservations. Hell, I even heard people pleading that no one should tell anyone anything, because you can tell the wrong person something, and you might even bring a curse onto yourself or your own family. Hopefully now you know why there isn't that many stories. You simply gotta become friends with a native well enough to hear a first-hand account of these paranormal stories. Why do you think the stories that you do find online usually begin with, "I have a friend who is native who told me this," or "My native friend wants me to post this on here"? I do have a story to share, don't worry, it won't bring a curse on you, nor will it have a skinwalker knocking at your window tonight, but it's one that I share with everybody. So here it goes. This is about an old native ghost sighting. Back when I was young, I was getting ready for bed, when out of nowhere, my cousin shows up in a panic asking for my dad. He starts saying that he needs to be smudged. Being smudged is where we light some sweet grass, kinda sacred, and we pray while you pat the smoke all over your body. Anyways, we do this, and he starts telling us what happened. Remember, it's about 10 p.m. or later. I was already in bed ready to sleep when all of this went down, so of course it woke everyone up. He said he was driving down the road going home from a friend's house when he was about to drive past the massacre spot. Well, the massacre spot is a monument going around this corner not far from my house. At the monument, are 8 or more graves along with a big stone shrine type of thing. And about 40 meters from there is another special cross where the priest was killed. I know the whole story, but I'm just giving you a little bit of details. So yeah, a massacre happened, and it's a creepy old dirt road with nothing else. We drive by it daily depending on where you're going. The place is creepy to me, and I try to stay away from it at night. Anyways, back to the story. He said he was driving past it when he started feeling nervous and scared. He said right as he was passing the monument, he looked over to his empty passenger seat, except this time, there was an old Native American sitting with him in full native gear, not saying anything, just staring at him. My cousin is a huge wuss, so he immediately pulled into our house. He didn't even look in his mirrors. He said he was too scared to look. Now, what makes me believe him is he straight out refused to drive home and asked to spend the night and sleep with someone in the house, which was me. As we were going to sleep, he even asked me to close my closet, which kinda scared me, and it also made me think that my great-grandpa was probably creeping on me through my closet. Now, when something happens to someone, you can feel and see the fear and panic in them. And that night, he was scared shitless, and it kinda scared me. But what really scared me and made me believe everything was that night as we were going to sleep, I could hear my dad in the living room talking with my mom. I don't know what they were talking about, but they stayed up pretty late, singing songs. And the next morning, a medicine man came by, and he started blessing our home, and he even told my cousin that he needed to get rid of the car. Yeah, I know this story wasn't about a skinwalker, but I'm sharing this with you to let you all know that there is another side of Native culture within the paranormal side of things, aside from the Americanized Skinwalker stories. And with this, I would advise you to never drive through the res at night.
I remember the call as if it happened an hour ago. A child taken in the middle of the night. My partner and I happened to be in the area when the call came through. My partner sipped his coffee as I turned on the lights and drove over to the location. We arrived at the destination about 15 minutes later. I stepped out of the car into the frigid night air and looked at the house. Everything seemed quiet. Then the front door of the house burst open, and a middle-aged woman ran out into the snow towards us. She was screaming for us to get her baby back. My partner sighed as I tried to calm the woman down. He wasn't doing that out of being bored, but more so annoyed. We have encountered missing persons cases before, and every single time, there was a mindless family member screaming in our faces. I know that dealing with a situation like this is extremely complicated, but when you become so worked up that you can't even think straight, well, that doesn't help anybody. After about 10 minutes of assurances, I was finally able to calm the woman down. I asked her if we could go inside the house to talk. She sniffled quietly and nodded. As the wind blowed against us, we stepped inside the house, and I asked the woman to sit before asking the general questions. Her name was Joyce Madison. She's a broker and a single mother of one. She called about her 10-year-old son, Peter Madison, a name that you should remember. She began explaining how this all started. I nodded to my partner to begin examining the house. Apparently, Peter had been having some issues over the last few months or so. She told me that one day, she was awoken to the screams of her son. Joyce jumped from her bed and ran to check on Peter. She found him sitting in his bed, crying. When she asked him what was wrong, Peter told her he saw a face staring at him through the window. Of course, Joyce didn't believe it, but still, like a good mom, she examined the window, peering deep into the snowy night. After finding nothing out of the ordinary, she suggested to Peter that it might have been just a nightmare. This went on for 3 months. Every so often, at least once a week, Peter would claim he saw someone outside his window. and would scream for his mom. She would wake up, check the surroundings, and find nothing there. She started to get worried about his mental health, and she eventually scheduled a therapist for Peter. During the last 2 weeks, Peter didn't seem to have any nightmares. According to his mom, she would wake up, make breakfast, and Peter would come downstairs. She would ask him how he slept, and he would simply reply with, "Fine." Joyce assumed that all the therapy sessions were helping Peter. Well, that was until tonight. She was woken about an hour ago to the screams of her son. When she realized what was happening, she got out of bed, rubbed her eyes, and walked over to her son's room. She opened the door and found that her son's window was broken open and that her son wasn't in bed. I nodded as I jotted down the information in my notepad, and once again, I told her we were going to do everything in our power to find Peter. I joined my partner, who was already in Peter's room. Looking around, the window was forced open, like somebody had pushed it from the outside. The bed next to the window was a complete mess. I clicked on the flashlight and leaned my head out of the window. At the base of the window were a pair of large footprints, but they seemed off. They weren't tracks left by someone that was wearing shoes. They were large and pointed at the ends, possibly belonging to an animal, but that didn't make any sense. The tracks then led away from the window into the darkness of the woods near the house. My partner looked at me and shook his head. He didn't have to say anything. I knew the chances of finding the boy were growing slimmer by the second. Either way, we walked out of the house and followed the tracks to the edge of the woods. I called out to Peter, but there was no response. The footprints led into the brush, and we followed them. The woods surrounding the town were extremely dense. Even in the middle of winter, the trees seemed to grow right on top of one another. We tried our best to follow the tracks, but they were starting to change, as if whatever this thing was had increased its pace. We followed them for another 15 minutes before the track suddenly stopped. We called out to Peter once again, shining our flashlights all around us in the process. There was no sign of him, or whoever it was that had taken him. Over the following days, we got together a few search parties for Peter. We searched most of the forest, at least the sectors near Peter's house. We spent so much time out there. In fact, some of our team helping with the search were starting to become ill. During those days, I paid a visit to Peter's therapist. It was a woman by the name of Dr. Betty Warner. She was shocked when I arrived. I inquired about Peter's sessions, and she was hesitating to tell me about them. However, after I told her that any information that she shares can actually help locate Peter, and so she became more understanding. She told me that Peter was hallucinating a monster, staring at him from outside his window at night. I let her know that I was fully aware that he was seeing something about once a week. Dr. Warner then shook her head and told me it wasn't once a week. It was every single night over the last few months. Every single night, something would be standing outside Peter's window, and it would be watching him. I wasn't sure what to say, but she continued. She said that the reason Peter would scream on those nights was because whatever it was trying to open his window. On most nights, it would just stand there and watch him, not even moving an inch. He spoke fondly of those nights because after an hour or so, this thing would leave, and then he could actually get some sleep. The other nights, the ones where the thing would press against the window, causing it to creak and groan under the pressure, were the nights when he would scream for his mom. I asked Dr. Warner if Peter ever described what this thing looked like. She paused briefly and said he only described it once in all the sessions that they had. He said it was tall, taller than his window. He said it had to bend down just to look inside. Its body was covered in long black fur. At first, he thought it might have been Bigfoot, but then he saw its face, bone, yellowish white. He said it would watch him without moving, but on some nights, it would raise a large claw hand and press on the window. Even though I had a hard time believing Dr. Warner, I made notes and nodded politely. A costume, maybe. I asked why Peter had stopped screaming during the last 2 weeks. The doctor then thought for a moment, and she assumed that he might have started realizing that it was all in his head. After 2 weeks of searching for Peter, we eventually called it off. There was no sign of the boy anywhere. This devastated Mrs. Madison. She got annoyed at the town and the police station for not being able to find the boy. A few days then passed since we called off the search. My partner and I were out doing our nightly patrol when I saw something out of the corner of my eye. It looked like a bear, walking on its hind legs in the dark, who was skirting along the nearby tree line. My partner was in mid-sentence when I slammed on the brakes. I turned on the searchlight. I quickly got out of my car and dashed over to the woods. My partner tried calling out to me, but his voice was fading in the distance. I ran through the woods, with the twigs and snow crunching beneath my feet. It wasn't long until I found a set of similar tracks, like the ones from before. I pushed further into the brush. Then I stopped, not because the track stopped, but because I found what was leaving them. I stared at it as it lumbered away from me. I could hardly believe what I was looking at. I called out to it, demanding that it stop, and it did, and it slowly turned to face me. I looked up at it, and its face was exactly as described, like the rotting carcass of an animal, for a face. Upon seeing this, I drew my gun and aimed at this creature. It took a step towards me. The ground shook slightly underneath this thing's weight. I fired. The gunshots reverberated throughout the forest. It then raised its hand as if to shield itself from the bullets. When my gun ran out, it let out a scream, but it also sounded like a roar. It took a step towards me, and in one swift motion, swung at me with its massive clawed hand. The impact sent me flying into a nearby tree. I awoke to my partner standing over me, talking into his radio. I looked around and noticed that I was no longer in the woods. Apparently, he found me and dragged me out of there. He said he was calling me an ambulance, and I told him not to worry about it. I was banged up for sure, but nothing to go to the hospital for. He asked me what happened in the woods after I ran in there. I just couldn't seem to find the words to answer him. I was just staring at the dark and lifeless trees in front of me. It's been about a week since that day, and 3 weeks since Peter has gone missing. My partner and I were once again driving around town, early in the morning, when we got a call about another missing child on the other side of town. My partner gave me an unsure glance, and for a brief moment, we both sat there, staring at the radio. I wanted to pick it up. I really did. But something inside of me was telling me that I got lucky last time and that I wouldn't get a second chance. As I started to move my hand over the radio, another car responded to the call. And I'm ashamed to admit to this day that as an officer, I was happy that it wasn't us. I have more questions than answers regarding the case of Peter Madison, like what this creature even was, or where it possibly came from, or why it's only interested in children. But I know 2 things for sure. 1, whatever it was, it definitely wasn't wearing a costume. And 2, it took 7 bullets at point blank range, and it was still able to attack me. I'm not sure what happened to young Peter Madison, but to be honest, I'm not sure that I even want to find out.
I want to talk about something that I encounter at the forest. I'm not much of a storyteller, so don't get too excited. This isn't one of those fake stories. It's my own account of a failed hunting trip with my uncle. So it was December of 2014. I'm 18. I'm 250 pounds. I'm a power lifter. I'm heavy looking, but I'm not fat. My uncle had a kid a year ago, so he hasn't been working out in that time. He's still strong as fuck. but he's just got a gut from all the downtime. This guy is my hero. He knows so much about the woods that the gods must have showed him. Me and my uncle are staying with a family in a mountain home in Arkansas. I've never been hunting out here, so I'm pretty excited. There's supposed to be elk out here. We don't exactly have a tag, but the game wardens never come out this far. So fuck it. We get up there at 3 o'clock in the morning to drive out as far as we can, and then we walk about 15 miles into the mountains. We're so deep that the mountains block all cell phone signals. I got my SKS. My uncle then gets me situated in a deer stand, cause he's already killed a deer this season, and he wants me to get one. I end up so well situated that you would never know I was even there, unless I pointed my phone's light at you. So we're sitting in this freezing temperature all day, and we see nothing but jack shit. My uncle told me to wait on him to come get me from my blind. It then starts to get dark, and I think, you should hurry up now. I mean, imagine being situated up in a deer stand, and there is nothing around you. No sounds, nothing, and then it starts to get dark. Well, he finally gets there, and at this point I'm ready to leave. He looks at me, and sees that I have my finger on the trigger, because I guess I was scared. But he also looks a little bit worried. He says something was following him there from his climbing stand. As soon as he says this weird smell fills the air. It's almost like rotting meat, but with something else. He then said, "Let's go. We have like a 3-hour walk ahead of us." We start walking, and the whole time I'm thinking, why would you take so long to come get me? If you knew we were still gonna have to walk a few hours. I mean, basic rules of hunting, right? You don't leave when it's getting dark. You leave a few hours beforehand. Anyways, as we're walking, that weird fucking smell is hitting us the entire time. At some point we're starting to get used to it. About an hour in, we hear this loud screech that quickly makes us point our guns where it was coming from. Think about the sound of a small gorilla if it was shot about 3 times in the guts. That's the kind of sound we heard. And by this point, we've been walking a while, so we're pretty much used to the darkness, but we still can't really see anything. My uncle then says, "Alright, you ready? We're gonna start jogging." After jogging for about 30 minutes, we hear this noise again. At this point I say screw it. I want to see what this thing is. I get out my pocket flashlight. I turn it on and grab the front of my SKS with the same hand, and I point my gun along with the flashlight to the area that the noise came from. I'll be honest, I don't really like describing this thing. I don't even like remembering it. Even now as I'm writing this, I'm just thinking about it. Just remembering it gives me chills. The image of this thing, this creature, has burned into my memory, and I'll never forget it. It was less than 15 yards away. It was a grizzly bear-sized cat, standing on all fours, about 5 feet tall at the shoulders, with horns like a mountain ram or something like that. It had shaggy dark hair. It then made this noise again, and it started jumping at where me and my uncle were standing at. I remember as soon as it started doing that, it almost looked like it was twitching the whole time as well. As soon as it started, me and my uncle dumped every single mag we had. My uncle was racking the slide and firing as fast as he could. I don't know if we killed it, but we didn't fucking stick around. If we didn't kill it, then it shouldn't exist because we shot it so much. Me and my uncle started running all the way back to his truck, and we booked it out of those woods not looking back. I still have 6 deer tags to fill, and I don't know if I'll ever go hunting again. My uncle even sold his truck because of the memories that he gets from it. I mean, he now drives a Chevy Sonic. I know, right? But I'm thinking about getting some help. I don't know if I'm gonna make it this year. So I had this friend who said that he would kill us if he ever ran into us again. He said he had killed some kind of creature, that there were 2 other creatures waiting to get him. I thought it was a complete joke. He said he didn't need to explain himself, And now, there is no communication with anybody in our group of friends. I'm the smartest one in our group and I'm able to have a general understanding of most things. He was saying some really silly stuff. He's the kind of guy who spent the last decade of his life trying to uncover the worst things out in the darkness. I mean, he ended up dropping his lifelong partners in crime. That's us, by the way. Saying that was the only way he could be happy. That he doesn't want to be caught again. He doesn't even acknowledge that we own a business together. The guy spent 10 years of his life in a place of desperation. Yet I could feel I knew exactly what he was doing. But that still didn't make him leaving out of nowhere less depressing. I wish I could have told him how sad and horrible it felt that he was leaving. I wish I was able to understand where he was coming from. Right before he left, he kind of started going crazy. We would be over at his house, and all of a sudden, he would start shooting guns out into the darkness. At one point, he ended up shooting his girlfriend's cat. He was yelling about the creature that he killed. He kept saying it was some kind of big monkey that had some evil eyes or something. I don't exactly remember what it was, but it was just bizarre. Sometimes we would be watching TV, and suddenly the TV would turn off all on its own, and he would scream at it and say, I shouldn't be watching this much TV anyways. He would sometimes go on rants about how the world has turned into a shitstorm, and that he was trying to put out the fires and a bunch of other crazy shit like that. I couldn't take him serious though. He would go on about how everything seems to be going on in a slightly twisted direction, but not in any way you could see. I would sometimes try to change the conversation to get his mind off of whatever it was that was bothering him. I considered getting help for him. I told him he was being led to believe something like people on the internet do. That he would be the weird person that was told to do something, and he would end up dead because of it. He was in a state of mind where he was oblivious to outside influence. People criticized him for making up things around these weird characters he had drawn. Now those drawings were disturbing. I always asked if I could see them, and he would show them to me, but he would never let me hold the drawings. He would say that all of this stuff going on is being caused by evil forces, and everything that he was achieving was giving people nightmares. He said that he was going to write some kind of manifesto, but I was able to talk him out of it. He never finished it. Of course it said what he was doing. After reading it, I started to understand. He talked about having a younger brother, who they used to explore the woods together a lot, but then his younger brother was found dead. Apparently he was torn to shreds and mauled to death by something. They said it was a bear, but he thought very differently. I never even knew he had a brother. He never told me. We were friends just out of high school, so I never met his parents. But one time before he left, I talked to his mom who was visiting from out of town. She told me about the son they lost, and I told her how I thought that he was struggling mentally, and then his mom said that he never thought it was a bear. After his brother died, he spent almost all his time out in the forest. This whole time that I knew him, I always thought he was some sort of survivalist, almost a doomsday prepper. But come to find out, he was looking for something, and to be honest, I think he found it, or it found him. I remember his drawings. They were of a killing in the forest by some kind of grotesque monster. This was surrounded by a bunch of people who were hugging the trees. I don't know if these were some sort of goat-head blood-drinking people that live in the forest, or if it was supposed to symbolize something, but people around us started getting mad at him because he blamed them for the death of his brother. His whole talk about his brother and the forest and his drawings, apparently everything stopped right before we became friends. I realized that he likely has some kind of PTSD related to his brother's death. I did confront him about it, and he said that I have become too involved and that it was time for him to leave. He said he was leaving to protect his friends. And then he disappeared for 3 weeks. I think he went to try to find whatever it was that killed his brother. I'm not sure what happened, He was found near the side of the road, loaded with ammo, holding a rifle, and bleeding out. He too had apparently been killed by a bear. After that, everything's been weird. His funeral is coming up, and lately, every time when I'm at home, I look out the window towards the forest, and I see branches move, and it just sends a chill down my spine. I know you might have some friends who tell you about some sort of monsters or things that they see. It might sound crazy, but you might want to start believing them. I always been curious as to why my Uncle Jerry would always keep his light on in his own room while he slept. I remember as a young boy trying to pry the answer from him, but I was always met with the same answer. I just sleep better with a light, for some reason, he would say. Early this morning, however, when I was helping him move a new dresser in his room, the topic was somehow brought up. You really want to know why I sleep with the light on? His face turned serious, and he lowered his voice slightly. I mean, I've only been asking you for 20 years, I said while laughing, but he didn't laugh. Instead, he gave me a look to shut up and listen, and this is what he told me. When I was a kid, around the age of 12, I never feared the dark. In fact, I enjoyed it. I found it peaceful, and I would let my imagination wander and come up with all sorts of shit. Until one night, Grandma and Grandpa took your dad up to Baldwin to do some salmon fishing in Michigan. I didn't feel like going. I was gonna have the house to myself and could do whatever I wanted. When they finally left, I remember being so excited. Up until this point, I had only stayed home one other time without them, but I had your dad with me. This time, however, I was gonna be completely alone. After they left, I put on some music pretty loud since Pops didn't like loud music. He was getting old. I was having a blast, watching whatever I wanted on the TV without having to take turns and whatnot. It might have been around 1 in the morning when I started to get tired and headed up to bed. I got dressed in my PJs and turned the lights off while clicking my fan on. It was pretty warm for a fall night, I remember. After a short while, I dozed off, but something woke me up. It sounded like a weird humming noise. I sat up and looked around the room wondering where it was coming from. I didn't see anything though. It was too dark. The humming sounded like it was coming from the corner of my room by the door. At this point, I was starting to feel a little uneasy, but I wasn't too scared. After all, it could have been anything. After a few minutes it stopped and everything went quiet again. Then, the clicking noise started. It sounded like someone was snapping their fingers, only fast and a little bit more quiet. What the fuck is that? I remember thinking. I still hadn't moved yet. I just sat up and listened. By now, my heart was racing pretty good and I was actually scared. I slowly rolled over and pulled the blankets up over my head. Jerry, I heard a soft whisper. As soon as I heard that, my heart almost pounded right through my chest. I could feel tears forming in my eyes. I was scared so bad. Everything went quiet again for a few seconds. That wasn't for long because soon after, I started to hear the floorboard start creaking. Whatever it was, it must have stood up because I could hear its bones crackling as it moved. The floorboard started creaking more as it made its way towards me. I squeezed my eyes shut as tight as I could, causing tears to run down my cheeks. Jerry, it whispered again, only this time right at the foot of my bed. That's when I felt the bed start to sink in down by my feet as it sat on my bed. Even through all of this, I still hadn't moved other than to cover my head with the blankets. I prayed it thought that I was sleeping and would move on. The bed started to sink down closer and closer as it crawled further into bed with me. That's when I started to smell this nasty egg smell, and it almost made me gag a few times. However, I held it in, scared that whatever this thing was would attack me if it heard me. Jerry, just look at me. It whispered again, except a bit louder.
Jerry, look at me now.
Its voice now a deep growl, filled with anger. I still didn't budge though, and I honestly think that this is what saved my life. The thing then started letting out this creepy laugh, as I felt the bed start to slowly release as this thing backed away. After a few seconds, it was out of the bed and I heard the creaking on the floor as it walked away. Even after I heard the door click shut, I still didn't move. I stayed laying with blankets over my head, all the way until morning before I finally peeked my head out. When I saw I was alone, I still didn't get out of bed. I just covered my head back up and went to sleep. When I woke up, I heard Grandma and Grandpa downstairs with your dad, and I felt so relieved I wasn't alone anymore. I never did tell them about what happened that night, nor did I tell your dad. I just kept my lights on ever since. Your grandparents stopped trying to get me to turn them off after a week or two, after I kept throwing massive fits every time they tried. So that's it. That's why I keep my lights on. And for some reason, I feel safer in the light. Like it won't come for me unless I'm in the darkness. You should keep your lights on too. Trust me. You don't want to go through what I did. You don't want to hear somebody whispering your name in a demonic voice in the middle of the night. It was the single most terrifying thing I ever been through. I live deep in the mountains and my hollow is surrounded by woods. There is a little spot you can walk to in the woods which is just a giant circle with trees open all around it. Me and my friend went to have a picnic there that day, and we started to hear what sounded like a flute. It was really loud coming from the direction where no house is there. Mind you, all my neighbors were old, and I can guarantee you that none of them spent their time walking deep in the woods to play the flute. We heard this for hours, and we left about 8 o'clock that night. And when we started walking back, you could hear it somewhat across the valley. I didn't hear it again for a good 2 years after. However, one night, I woke up at 3 a.m., and my bed was right next to the window, and I had it cracked to let some fresh air in while I was sleeping. I woke up to the sound coming right outside my window, and I was scared to look out to see what it was. It went on for about an hour before it stopped playing, and I never did hear it again. I did talk to a few friends about this, and one of them said to not worry about anything. It's most likely a native spirit that has enjoyed the positive energy me and my friends brought to the forest, and it decided to check in on me down the road. Now that I think about it, it didn't feel evil. The only time it did worry me was waking up to it outside my window. I also done some research, and apparently if there's water nearby, you'll also hear drums. Other beliefs like if you hear it during the night, it's a bad omen, but if you hear it during the day, it should be something good. However, there's also been stories about people gone missing in the woods after hearing flute-like sounds, or that there's something that wants you to go look and follow it, and it might not be good, especially at 3 a.m. in the morning. I'm sure there's some truth to these beliefs, and the true meaning behind it has been twisted and distorted by now, as it's been passed on through different people. If anybody knows a medicine man, or a true native person, would you mind asking them for me and letting me know?
I never told this story to anyone, and I don't really intend to tell it again. I have a pounding migraine today, and this thread has kept me good company as I drifted in and out. I actually don't like talking about this time in my life. When I was around 12, I lived with my mom. We were below the poor level, We lived up in the mountains around Santa Cruz, California. My mom had a friend that owned a large bit of property up there, and he let us stay in a trailer up there. Our trailer was very small and was right beside a garden. A chain link fence ran around the garden to keep the dog the owner had out, along with other animals. All kinds of deer and things are very common in the area. Also, along the fence area was a single room. It was like a tiny house, but it was only a single room on the inside. This room had light, and since our actual trailer didn't, I spent a lot of my time in there. By the way, sorry that the story will be fairly long. I'm actually pretty bad at writing. I just want to say that first, as this will be the only time. So there's this one thing you should know right now. This small fenced-in area was only a small part of the property, but most of it was just a bunch of woods. Also, I refused to leave the fence area because the owner's dog had been mistreated by children in the past and was very sketchy towards me all the time. If I was alone, it would try to bite at me, even through the fence. The fence was tall, at least 7 feet high, and wasn't even movable. So as long as the gate was closed, I was safe. With that being said, there is no one else around us for miles and miles. Now I'm telling you all this because I think it's important that you understand what kind of scene this was before I really get into the story. So we have a fenced-in location that seems fairly safe. It contains a trailer and a single room with power that is not connected to the trailer. Nothing else around for miles. My mom's van is parked out in front of the gate to the fenced-in area, and a single unpaved road runs from this garden for about a mile to the main house. Now then, I would bring friends up there to sleep over here and there. We all thought it was pretty cool, you know. Besides, we would get our own room to stay in, to play video games all night long. It was like a dream come true. The only downside was simple. When it would get dark outside, it would get really dark. No city around, and the trailer would not be lit up. There was no bathroom to use in the room, and you would have to walk through the dark garden in order to get to the trailer to use it. Strange things would happen out here from time to time. It was always something that could be somewhat easily explained away though. Noises like people working at night, or once me and a friend were sitting out in the garden and we saw a shadow as big as a small bear bound up a tree, but the tree didn't shake like there was weight on it. The dog also creeped me out, but you know, angry dog, and I was a kid. It happens. Now, I do get scared pretty fast. I always been that way. For example, I have trouble walking through a lit house if I'm alone. My friends, however, tend to be more outgoing, just the kinds of people I get along with. This time, I had a friend over. His name was Jacob. We were staying up all night and playing Sonic the Hedgehog 3 on my Sega Genesis. We started playing as the sun went down, and by the time we were finishing up the game, it was around 2 a.m. That's when we heard it. We turned off the game, getting ready to find something else to play. There was a rumbling in the woods behind the room we were in, like somebody was rolling something really heavy around. We hadn't heard it before, because the noise from what we were playing was loud. I immediately got goosebumps. Jacob was not really worried about it, but it's not like there was someone else's house a yard right over there. It was just a forest, for miles, and it sounded like someone was constructing something or some shit, dragging and rolling something really heavy. Eventually, Jacob convinced me to just play some more games. I agreed on the condition that we turn the volume down so we could hear if something happened. We started playing, and I didn't even notice that the noise had stopped because I was into the game. A couple hours later, Jacob said he had to use the bathroom. I was feeling fine by then, so I was fine when he left to the trailer to relieve himself. He was taking a while, so eventually, I decided I was gonna go check on him. Besides, I could use the bathroom and grab a snack while I was at it. I got up and opened the door to leave, and when I opened it, he was just standing at the doorway, right outside the door, facing it. It scared the shit out of me. That's when I asked what he was doing, and he just stood there, blocking the exit. I realized he must have sneaked up to the door because I could hear him walk away from the room, but I hadn't heard him walk back up to it. It was super quiet out there, without the noises of the city. I should have been able to hear, but he refused to say anything or respond. He just stood there. I told him he was really creeping me out, but it wasn't like him to try to scare me like this. Finally, I decided to just go to the trailer and use the bathroom myself. I told him what I was gonna do. Then I moved past him, but when I pushed him out of my way a little, his skin felt freezing to the touch. I jumped a little, but it was a cold night, and he had been standing out there for like 30 minutes, so I figured that was to be expected. I walked as quickly as I could over to the trailer, and that's when he followed me, like, right on my tail. It was unnerving. I joked a little, saying that he already surprised me by scaring me at the door. The joke is over already. Finally, I got to the trailer and walked in. He didn't follow. He just stayed at the doorway. Now, I want you to picture this. Imagine inside a trailer with the door open in the middle of the night, and your friend is just standing outside a trailer looking in. I checked on my mom, who was fast asleep. Then I turned to go into the bathroom. It was a porta potty, and we keep the bathroom door shut because it smells bad. When I reached for the door and tried to open it though, it was locked. That's when I heard a nervous voice come from behind the door. In here. I quickly turned to look at Jacob, but the door was still open and there was nothing there but pitch black night. I froze. I would have heard the bathroom door open if he had come in behind me and gone that way. There is no way to do it quietly. That's when I just yelled out so loud that my mom woke up. I stared at the doorway, unable to bring myself to move a muscle. She got up, walked over there, and looked out. Not seeing anything, she closed the door and asked me what was wrong. By now, Jacob was coming out of the bathroom and acting perfectly normal, but just a little bit confused. I explained what happened, and Jacob said he was just taking a long time in the bathroom, basically. None of them believed me at all, no matter how much I insist. My mom is sure that I just got sleepy and imagined it, and Jacob thought I was trying to prank him. So my mom gets out a big flashlight and walks us back to the room. She tells us to go to sleep, then she leaves and goes back to the bed herself. Now, this room doesn't have any windows or anything, so after a while, I calm back down a little bit. I'm telling myself that my mom was right. It must have been like a waking dream or something. Meanwhile, Jacob insists that he was in the bathroom the whole time, and I'm inclined to believe him, because there is just no way to really get around without being heard. So I settled down, but I'm a little rattled, but I'm thinking that I can just sleep it off throughout the night. Suddenly, the dog starts going nuts, right behind us. The room is up against the fence, so the dog must have been like right behind the room on the other side. I guess when the dog started going nuts, I got scared, because Jacob started laughing at me and said, "The dog barking at a squirrel or some shit, and you're over here shitting yourself." It keeps going like that for a long time though. Suddenly, the barking stops and gets replaced by whimpering. We hear the dog run away. There's about 45 seconds of silence before we hear something new. A small stretching sound on the back wall of the room. We both try to be silent as we can. Eventually, it stops. After 5 or so minutes of silence, Jacob decides to be brave. He decides that he's gonna wake up my mom to tell her something crazy is going on. I wish he wouldn't leave me alone, but there's absolutely no way I'm gonna go out there. He arms himself as best as he can with a tennis racket we had in the room with us. Then he takes a couple small steps and opens the door and dashes out. I close it as quick as I can behind him. In less than 30 seconds, I hear a scream. Not long after, the door flies open, and he comes back in looking pale as a ghost. He looks tired and his breathing is like he just ran a marathon. His eyes look as big as dinner plates. I then ask what is going on like 4 times before he finally starts getting words out. He tells me he walked out there and he was walking through the garden as quick as he could, and then he saw my mom, just standing there. He tried to talk to her, but she stared at him with a blank expression. Getting super creeped out because of what happened to me earlier, he took a couple more steps towards her, telling her that he thought something was in the woods. Suddenly, her face turned to an awkward smile. Then he realized something terrible. He hadn't noticed sooner because of the darkness. She was on the other side of the fence. Now, the door to this room does not lock, and as I explained earlier, this room had no windows. As he is telling me what happened, he is also at the same time putting stuff in front of the door, and by the end, I was helping him. In retrospect, whatever was harassing us seemed to not want to actually enter the room or the trailer, because the Jacob one didn't come into the room or to the trailer itself. Either way, we stacked everything we could against the door, thinking somehow, like in cartoons, this would actually definitely keep the creature out. So for the rest of the night, we heard scratches coming from all around the room. I, of course, ended up crying. Jacob looked like his mind had left his body with fear. At one point, whatever was out there was speaking as well. I heard it from right next to me where I was resting against the wall, in my mother's low voice, the same exact phrasing she had used earlier in the night. "What's wrong?" Followed by, "Go to sleep." The sun must have come up eventually. The scratching as well stopped. We heard my mom come to get us. This time, we actually heard footsteps. We of course refused to leave the room. My mom had to go get the property owner and have him take the door off. When we saw that it was actually her, I burst into tears again. We never had any experiences like these again, and we eventually moved away. But that one night still haunts me. I still refuse to go out at night unless I'm with a bunch of people, and I will never, ever live in the woods again. Anyways, I hope you all enjoyed hearing about this, as I probably won't tell the story again. Thanks for listening. So before I begin the story, I want to give you some context that will help you understand where I'm coming from. So why does a Skinwalker curse you? Sometimes a person or a family will pay a Skinwalker to curse someone they hate. Even family members will curse their own family. There are different ways they can actually curse somebody. The common way is to visit the person's house and leave a cursed item on the property. The actual shape-shifting is to invoke fear in people. Nowadays, most of them are just hired. Acquiring wealth is one of their main priorities. We know Skinwalkers are normal people like you and I. However, they do practice witchcraft when they aren't in skin. Or, they practice what Americans call witchcraft, or bad medicine you can say. Can they just hop in a car and drive to Florida or New York or something? Well, of course they can. But will they? Most likely not. You see, skinwalkers are the opposite of what our traditions and culture teach us. They are medicine men who were simply overcome with greed and hatred, or power. When they aren't causing evil, they simply are practicing bad medicine, grave robbing, spreading fear, and causing sickness. This is why if you live in the city or outside of the nation, the chances of you encountering a skinwalker are basically 0. It would be hard to find work in an area with no Navajo people, which is why I doubt they would move off the reservation or to an area with few Navajo people. Skinwalkers stick around the rest for the most part. After all, they are native people using black magic. I would even go on and say that there aren't that many alive today. They're not spirits. They can actually be killed. But what about your cat or dog or chihuahua being a skinwalker? Well, they can, but the actual pet would have to be dead first. They can't copy a living animal. They need the actual skin. Like I said, skinwalkers mainly target people they were hired to, which again, if you live in the city, you have nothing to worry about. Now, can a curse follow you even years after you have moved? Well, of course, which is why I want to share this story with everyone, to show you that they only target people they were hired to. The first thing I want to say is that I am Navajo. I do have a lot of stories about encounters with Yinagloshis, which you might know them as skinwalkers. However, the word skinwalker is basically Americanized. So there was a woman that was infatuated with my grandpa. She requested that my grandpa build her a home. However, the woman thought that as my grandpa worked on her home, she could get him to fall in love with her in the process. The deal was done, and my grandpa built the woman a house. My grandpa collected his payment, but instead of getting with the woman, he ended up marrying somebody else, which was my grandma. The woman became enraged with jealousy and ran the newly married couple out of the community. The couple relocated and started a new life. They had 6 children, 2 of them being twin girls, 1 of them being my mom. In the Navajo tradition, twins are seen as very powerful. My grandpa began construction on a new home. While they were building the house, all the children, including my mom, would play outside as the adults worked. As they were playing, my aunt noticed an animal emerge from the woods. It was a coyote. Most of the time, coyotes are very skittish and avoid humans at any cost. However, this coyote made its way closer to my mom. A strange smell filled the air, like something dead. The coyote then came right up to her. She said it didn't bite her, but instead knocked her down, put its mouth over her mouth, and began to suck the air from her. It was at this point that she actually passed out. One of the grown-ups that was working on the house saw what was going on, and everyone ran towards the coyote and my mom. All the grown-ups were yelling and shouting as they ran towards them. The coyote darted back into the woods, and my mom fell to the ground. She was blue. The family worked fast and were able to wake her back up. This incident, of course, caused my family to go see a medicine man. He revealed to them that it was the woman still harboring jealous feelings towards my family, even after all these years. So the medicine man had a prayer done, and it was thought to be the end of it. Later, the family received the news that the woman, eventually, passed away. As more time passed, construction on the home continued and all my aunts and uncles continued to grow. They had built the first story of their home and moved in. My mom shared the bedroom with her twin sister, and they slept together on the king-size bed. It was a hot summer night and the family kept all of the windows open. One night, my mom left the room to use the bathroom. The family kept a small light in the hallway. She got out of bed, walked down the hallway, and did her business. She returned to bed, and as she was covering herself, she happened to look up. She froze. At the open window was a coyote. Its eyes were shining from the hallway light. The window was pretty high, and so the coyote had to have been standing on its hind legs. My mom was frozen with fear, and she made eye contact with it. It was then that she noticed that same smell, the smell of death. She snapped and ran out of the room screaming and crying. She ran to her parents' room and got my grandpa. He ran into the bedroom, half expecting it to be a figment of her imagination. But the strong smell hit him as well, and there was the coyote still standing at the window. My grandpa yelled and ran to get his rifle. He then ran out of his home, but the coyote was gone. My grandparents tried to comfort my mom, but she cried until morning. And again, my family seeked out the medicine man. The medicine man came around the house and they spent a few hours outside. I was told they ended up digging holes outside and recovered what they call a bundle. The medicine man said that inside the bag was hair, nails, and small pieces of what looked to be decomposing flesh. He explained to my family that the hatred that this woman had for them was so strong that the evil intentions that she had for my family continue even after the woman passed away. When my grandparents were blessed with the twins, the woman knew of the strength that it would bring to the family, and so she actually wanted to get rid of my mom, and so she ended up contacting a skinwalker. My mom says that the coyote that she saw at the window is the same one that attempted to suffocate her. Even the smell of death was familiar the second time that she encountered the skinwalker. She hasn't seen it since that night, and nobody, including my mom, has had any more experiences like this. This is also why we as Navajos burn clothing and personal items of family who has moved on. We don't keep anything belonging to the dead. Keeping these items can actually make you sick or suffer things in your life. As I said in the beginning, skinwalkers do the opposite. They use bones and hair from the dead and victims to create these bundles to place near a person's home and have a curse fall on the person. We still go by our traditions, and a lot of stuff is kept within our tribes and cultures. I would also like to note that I personally share my experiences with family members only. One of the main reasons is because we have more respect for all of our ancestors and the dead, and it's considered part of our culture spiritually, not as something to talk about and scare each other for fun. We have a reverence for the dead, as where modern Americans hold one ceremony and leave them for memory. Most of us don't even like talking about these kind of stories or ghost stories in general, because it's actually dishonoring to the dead. We normally talk about our ancestors and how they lived, and if we happen to see them again as a ghost, then we honor them. I have seen my fair share of spirits, and it's just another part of being human. Dying is not fear, no heaven, no hell, just a lesson learned to go into the next life. There's also no such thing as a friendly ghost. In our culture, a ghost will never have your best interest at heart. The chende, or quote-unquote ghost, that people talk about is more feared than a skinwalker. Like I mentioned, there is no such thing as a good ghost. They're all bad. The reason why is because when a person passes, all that was good in them rises up and scatters to become part of the Great Spirit, or just simply everything. However, what was bad and dark about the person is the only thing that remains, as it's too heavy to leave. The beliefs about chende being bad and something to fear is one of our strongest beliefs. If a person dies in a hogan or in another dwelling place, it becomes a house belonging to the dead. Traditionally, nobody would ever live there again. If it was a store, people might actually close the store after somebody died. We also don't cry too much at the funeral of a loved one, or actually grieve for too long for fear of that chende coming. We also don't touch objects that belong to them, for fear of attracting the dead's chende. Maybe in another story, I'll go more into detail about chendes. Now, before I end this story, as much as I said that you don't gotta worry about skinwalkers, and even after learning and knowing, and if you're still pretty convinced you came across one, even though I'm pretty sure you would know, and you wouldn't be posting or asking, did I come across a skinwalker? Trust me, you would know. In all seriousness, get a medicine man to bless your house. If you're concerned about protection, they should give you arrowheads or something. I won't go too much into detail about the ceremonies. I also think you can buy some arrowheads blessed directly by a medicine man for protection. I don't recommend you doing any ceremonies by yourself or any incantations, no matter what videos or things you heard or actually read online. There's a reason why the elders are the only ones who do this. I would suggest hiring a medicine man from a nearby tribe to help you. If a skinwalker has cursed you, the last thing you want to do is for this curse to spread even more into your life. My grandfather, a wonderful medicine man, he would always warn me about people who go back on their medicine. For example, they would say prayers in reverse and even singing the songs backwards. We would be eating dinner and he would just stop and shake his head before going back to eating and say, he used to be a good man. I think his medicine was strong enough that he would be able to hear neighboring medicine men, and he would scare me by saying stuff that I had forgot about. For example, drinking, smoking, some nights with women, and some other stuff like that. He would just ask and it felt like he already knew. But one thing that I'll never forget, and he completely chewed me out for this, was when I was walking counterclockwise in his Hogan. He barked at me and told me that I might just undid some help to a person who was actually needing it. So to this day, even in my own apartment, but when I'm walking around, I'll walk around clockwise. See, there's something about opposite and reverse. Those reverse people actually become witches, or sometimes even worse. I'm not going to go too much into detail about this, but I just want to let you all know that there is power everywhere. It's easy to make the wrong move if you're not informed. The other reason I'm saying this is because I know a lot of people like ghost stories, and some of you claim that you want to see a ghost. But let me tell you, it's not fun. And until you live with the problem of energy or spirit that causes issues, you're going to rethink what you wish for. Back in 2016, I was turning 23, and I chose to take a trip from Central Texas to Colorado Springs, where my uncle is at. This was for my birthday, which is on October 31st. My friend Sam and I set out for Colorado on the 25th and got there on the 26th. We spent the first 4 days doing normal stuff, going through the shops in Denver, the Garden of the Gods, and also drove up to Pikes Peak. So the night before Halloween arrives, we were sitting in my uncle's backyard around a fire pit, smoking of course. I mentioned that I haven't gone camping in quite some time, and my friend jumps at the opportunity. He quickly starts planning a camp out for the next night. Halloween arrives and we start packing for our camping trip. We throw in some blankets, a tent, some cooking supplies, and some flashlights. I also borrow some bear mace from my uncle, and we headed out towards White River National Forest. Specifically, this was on Henry Mountain. I think even just typing out the name again gave me chills. So we finally get up the mountain around 11 a.m. The campsite is set up by 12 o'clock with a rock fire pit in the middle, surrounded by 2 logs. And my tent is facing away from the mountain in the forest. So let me tell you what happened. And I don't exactly remember what time it was, but we had been sitting, smoking some weed, and talking since the sun went down. It then starts to get too cold for me, and we go inside the tents to warm up and call it a night. I wake up sometime later in the dark, and to be honest, I'm freezing. I realize that we packed like idiots and we're not ready for a night on top of a mountain. I wake Sam up and say we should go to the Forerunner and sleep back there. He agrees in less than a second. I guess he was also cold. So I unzip the tents and I take a knee to tie my boots, while my friend starts gathering up the blankets and pillows. I look at the fire pit that we had made, but it looks like someone had messed with it. Like somebody had done something with the ashes, and half the rocks from the pit were gone, with no trace of where they went.
I shrugged off that I fell asleep first, so I figured that Sam maybe did it for some reason when I was sleeping. So we jog over to the Forerunner from the code, and I throw the blankets and pillows in, and we jump in. So an hour later or so, my friend is snoring away, and I happen to be wide awake. I can't get the fire pit out of my head. It just gave me a creepy feeling, almost eerie-like. He wouldn't mess with the fire pit that we spent all afternoon making. I eventually give up and I decided to start smoking. So I moved to the driver's seat by just crawling from the back. I take a look around. It was like my windshield had become a portal to the darkness. I put a headphone in my right ear, and I grab my pipe, and I start loading it. That's when I hear something. I pause the music, and I lean towards the window, using my arm against the door to steady myself. I was listening for anything out of the norm, and my friend's snoring wasn't helping. So I kind of push him and he kind of wakes up. I heard him ask if I was smoking or not. I gave him the pipe and I told him to shut up and listen. Suddenly, we heard something clicking. Both of us heard it. I could see the reaction on his face. I turned back to look and I put my arm against the door. That's when I felt it in my arm. A slight vibration in the door every time I heard a click. Then it hit me. Someone, or something, was trying to open the door. Immediately, a million thoughts ran through my head. And the second one was fuck all this. It happened again 2 more times. It was just switching doors when I'm watching in the span of 5 seconds. Right after the second pull, I heard the door behind me trying to open. Then the back right, then the hatch, and finally, the passenger side door. I was shocked and speechless like never before. I had seen nothing like this and it was happening so fast. I remember this cold feeling in the pit of my stomach as I looked at the passenger window. Now, all of my windows have limo tint, which is why I couldn't see outside, and I also know anybody outside couldn't see in. But as I was looking over at the window, I heard 3 small taps. That's enough, I say out loud. I turned to my friend and I told him to hand me the keys. As I did, they realized that we were in the car and not in the tent. I say this because as I flick on the high beams, I felt everything inside of me die. There was 20 plus people in the forest. One of them seemed to be pouring something on our tents, and a few others were pulling up the tent spikes. For a second, they were frozen like deer in the headlights, and I wonder how long they've been watching us for. I throw the car into reverse and go down the mountain so fucking fast that somewhere along the way, I ended up breaking the exhaust. On the way down, I realized that they were gonna light the tent on fire and then drag it off the cliff. We did speak to the police, but they found nothing. They couldn't even find our tent or any traces that we were even there. I had my uncle weld a new exhaust, and I ended up leaving for Texas that afternoon. I haven't been back to Colorado since then, and I will most likely never go there again. Please be careful when you go camping or hiking out in the forest. Sometimes we fear the paranormal or something that might be out there, but to be honest, the real monsters are humans. I want to share this story with you all about my friend who we used to make fun of whenever we would go camping or basically anywhere outdoors. He would always say that he has to watch the fire, and we would just make fun of him. That is, until he told us why he does that. Back when his grandfather was still alive, my friend was about 16 and was going camping with his grandfather near the house. My friend was the typical fat kid who plays too many video games. He had gone camping before, but never needed to learn much about the outdoors. However, his grandfather was a badass Native American from the Passamaquoddy tribe. I'm being serious, his grandfather was awesome. He was a scrappy old man that had won many competitions for his archery skills. The man was a master with a bow. He was very passionate about his culture
and very outspoken about casinos, and he was just a really old school gentleman with some great stories. On this weekend, his grandfather takes him backpacking down near the river, near their home. It's about 4 miles along the railroad tracks, and then some rocky cliffs to get there. My friend is all excited to camp in the trees, to fish in the river, that sort of thing. They reach this massive sand pit. The area is low and surrounded by a much higher and denser wooded area. It's tough to climb down into, but easy to get out of. His grandfather then says, "We're here." My friend then questions his grandfather's choice of location, but he knows that his grandfather knows best, since he is a wilderness man. They set up camp, but the whole night his grandfather seems tense. When they sit around eating dinner, my friend's grandfather is mostly quiet, watching the fire and staring off into the tree line, almost in a trance. My friend notices that his grandfather is tensely holding onto his bow, which is about an arm's length from his body, leaning against the chair he was sitting in. My friend tries a few times to engage with him, and eventually gets his grandfather's attention. His grandfather shows him some cool things that night, some stuff about wood, and also about playing guitar. My friend eventually gets tired after a few hours and goes to bed. He then gets to asking his grandfather when he's gonna go to bed, and he says that he came because he has to watch the fire. My friend decides to go to bed, hoping that his grandfather will eventually catch up. A few hours pass and my friend wakes up to rustling outside the tent. He then pokes his head out to find his grandfather still watching the fire and staring at the tree line. "Grandpa, what are you doing?" "It's past midnight." His grandfather responds, "Watching the fire. You go to bed and get yourself some rest." My friend at this point is getting weirded out, but he just goes back to sleep. The next morning, my friend gets up to find his grandfather cooking breakfast over the same fire and whistling happy. He then asks his grandfather what time did he go to bed, and his grandfather just replies, "When they stop watching my fire." My friend is creeped out by this and he asks his grandfather what he meant, but he gets no response. They spend the morning doing quote-unquote man stuff, but that afternoon his grandfather seems to be in a hurry, and he tells my friend to go get some more firewood before the night. My friend walks out of the sandpit and into the trees to grab some branches. He notices an arrow sticking out of a tree, nearly at head level. When he's finally standing up, he shouts back to his grandfather that he's a crazy old man, and comes back down with the firewood and the arrow. The grandfather thanks him and he just stores the arrow away. Again, my friend starts asking him about this, but he gets nothing of an explanation. Both of them get the fire going again. Then they eat dinner and go about their night telling stories. My friend then asks his grandfather about his heritage, which his grandfather was excited to talk about. He tells my friend the story of there being 2 types of creatures in the world: those who watch the fires to keep them lit, and those who watch fires to put them out. His grandfather follows up by saying that fire brings a lot of good into the world, but there are some things who don't like that and actually want to destroy it. When the fire goes out, it's a sign of a bad omen. My friend is still creeped out at this story, but after that, he says his grandfather never made reference to it again. The night of camping continues, and my friend goes to bed. His grandfather stays out to watch the fire once again, and my friend just gives up trying to get him to rest. The next morning, he wakes up, and just like in a scary movie, the fire is out. There's just ash. There's nothing. His grandfather is missing. My friend starts panicking and looks all around the campsite. He finds his grandfather's bow is gone, and it's clear that the grandfather scrambled because things that he should have taken, like his shoes, were left at the campsite. My friend figures he can go wander up to where he found the arrow of the day before and see if his grandfather was just grabbing wood, even though he's definitely in panic mode. On his way up the hill to the trees, he sees tracks in the sand, possibly his grandfather's. My friend makes it into the woods and sees a few arrows here and there, most of them on the ground, and looking like they were fired from the sandpit below. One arrow is clearly stuck in a tree, where it's actually struck a little bit above the level for my friend, who's about 6 feet at the time. Attached to the head of the arrow is a patch of fur. The tree also bears a small patch of what looks like blood around the impact area. My friend then starts basically shitting his pants at this point, wondering if his grandfather was attacked by an animal. My friend then has a moment of strange clarity, which he can't really describe. He said it felt like one of those miraculous moments that you hear about in the news, when a parent suddenly can hear their baby crying when they're in danger. He decides to go back to the camp and relight the fire to maybe signal to his grandfather. He gets the fire going, smoky and bright, and then throws on his gear to start searching the perimeter of the pit. At this point, my friend is shouting his grandfather's name. As he's walking the area near where he found the bloody tree, he hears something, almost like an injured animal. This is then followed by what he described as one of the nastiest shrieks he had ever heard in his life. He shudders a bit just telling me the story. My friend turns his head towards the direction of the sound, and he sees his grandfather sprinting through the trees, barefoot with his bow and beelining directly towards the campsite. My friend also runs towards him. His grandfather thanks him for watching the fire, and then tells him that they need to leave right now. The two start to pack up, even though his grandfather is slower at this. My friend sees some bruises and cuts on his grandfather's body, and he's asking him if he's okay. At this point in the story, my friend starts to cry, and he says that his grandfather gave him the biggest, happiest smile that he had ever seen in his life. His grandfather reassures him that everything will be fine, and the two of them hike all the way back home. After that, his grandfather was back to his normal self, even though my friend and him grew much closer until he died. His grandfather only recounted the story with my friend in small parts, never really telling my friend what he saw or shot out in the forest. To this day, he swears that he saved his grandfather's life, but he'll never know what it was that was stalking them during those days. And as we started getting old, whenever we would go camping as friends, he continued being diligent about the fire, as his grandfather was. Of course, we all made fun of him for it, until he shared the story with us. There are some things that the elders do that we might find funny or don't understand, but trust them, there's a reason behind everything. I got something that happened recently to me. I work for a larger firm in the northeastern US. My parents own a small farm, so I know firsthand how different things can be on both. For example, if your farm is big enough and has enough workers, you can actually get sick days, which is what I had to take 3 days to go. I'm getting ahead of myself though. It was how I think I got sick that is more interesting. I'm in charge of rounding up the animals in a group for milking in the mornings, and also towards the night. It was really nice outside, even for 5 in the morning, and the sun was just rising. Most of the cows sleep together out in the open, but some of them go hiding in the forest, where it's hard to take my 4-wheeler, which is what I saw a group of them doing. So it was by foot and into the underbrush I went, and that's where things went wrong. So I got off right where I could see the cows, and only had to make a few turns and dips to get to them. I get to the group of 4, and I round them up. I chased them out of the woods. One of them is a big old girl who likes to bully people because she's bigger and she thinks she's better than you. So she took a swing at me a few times with her head, which actually prompted me to calling her every name in the book I could think of. And she's fucking lucky she's pregnant, or else I would have sold her myself. She completely ignores me and goes off with the rest of her little posse to the larger stream of animals that are heading down through the field. At this moment, I'm not too worried about heading out after them, and this is because I'm one of the 5 people that herds the animals. I ended up getting caught on a patch of brambles.
and I was trying to get free when I hear this squeal coming further from the forest. Just thinking about it gives me chills. It sounded kind of like a deer screaming, but it was much more too loud, and it sounded a little bit different. I was standing there calling the thorn patch, waiting for it to happen again, when I hear this strange shuffling to my right. I'm not sure what it is, but it looked like a naked human. It had the arms and legs and torso, but they were all way too long and also thin. Its arms and legs were all sticking out. It was walking towards me, and it also had these really horribly weird jerky movements. It seemed to try to be looking at me over its shoulder, and all I could see were those yellow eyes and those awful teeth. So I said, fuck the brambles, fuck everything. I scrambled the fuck out, tearing through my flesh and clothes in the process. I hear this massive crashing, but at that point I was too terrified to look and see if it was the abomination or not. My four-wheeler was still there and running by some miracle, but it was facing the direction of the woods, which I was pretty sure that I didn't do. So I jumped on, which made me face the woods again. The thing was gone, but I didn't stop to really examine the brush line. I turned around in a tight circle and I just got the fuck out of there. When I finally got down into the main field, the tail end of the line was heading into the barn, and 3 of the other people were at the bottom chatting. They all looked up when they saw me driving up. One of them raised his arms in a what the hell happened gesture, but I didn't give him time to speak before I jumped off. I told him everything that happened and what I saw, not even stopping to think that they might believe that I was crazy. They all looked at me a little uncomfortable, not because of what I was telling them, but because of how scared I seemed to be, and how I kept looking over my shoulder to see if this thing had finally made its way to the woods or not. One of the guys called the herdsman that's in charge of the cows and told him there was a situation in the group. Nothing terrible was said, just that I had seen something out in the woods, and they looked more dangerous to people than to the cows. I got reassigned to milking to finish my shift, so I didn't have to go back out there, and everyone considered that to be the end of it. Except, it wasn't. As I was helping for the milking, I started feeling shaky and chilly. I figured I was just coming down from an adrenaline high from everything that happened. But as the milking progressed, this was obviously not the case. Several of the milkers were saying how pale I was, and they were alarmed at the scratches on my arms and face. They said it looked like an animal had attacked me. I told them that I ended up getting caught up on some thorns before one of them took a picture of me with her phone and showed me what I looked like. It really did look like something had attacked me. I'm talking claw marks on my neck, on my arms. I even had a black eye that I had no idea that I even had. Needless to say, this freaked me out pretty badly, to the point where one of the milkers called the herdsman and told me to go to the office so I could check out and go home. Nobody really wanted me to be on my own, so one of the milkers actually walked me to the office, which was only like 50 feet away, but I was still very glad for the company. Being outside made me start looking for the thing again. The herdsman was in the office along with my boyfriend, who's actually the herdsman's nephew. The herdsman is the co-owner of the farm, so he can basically make executive decisions about the stuff that goes on, and I had decided that my boyfriend would take me home. At this point, I didn't want to be alone. The herdsman and my boyfriend were talking to each other as I felt a fever at this point, when I started to hear this long drawn out scraping sound, almost like something big was rubbing up against the side of the office wall. I cut into the conversation asking if there was a cow possibly outside that was loose, because I thought that I could hear one outside. This got me a funny look, but my boyfriend went to one of the windows to look outside. Apparently, there was something out there, but it wasn't a cow. It looked human, and it was standing in the gravel driveway. My boyfriend then said, "Can I help you?" to the person, and had turned to go to the door so he could speak more normally. The conversation went like this: "What can I do for you?" Silence. "Is there anything we can help you with?" Silence. If you need anything, just let us know. He and the herdsman had another conversation about who the fuck was outside and why they were acting so weird. The herdsman went to talk to the guy, and my boyfriend turned back to me to help me so I could go home. Well, he's gone now. That's when me and my boyfriend looked at each other. Like, how could the guy just be gone? My boyfriend decided that I would ride in a tractor with him for the next 7 hours instead of going home, which I didn't want to. His other option was that I go to the doctor, which we thought about. I really didn't want to be alone and possibly encounter this man again. I hadn't taken into consideration that the fields that my boyfriend was working in were surrounded by the woods, however. It was only around 8:30 when my boyfriend finally decided that he was done with work and was parking that I did see something way off on the other side of the field that he had been working in. I saw something standing between the trees. Definitely a person, but they just kept standing there completely motionless. It felt like they were staring straight at me, just like I was staring at them. I went home and was taken to the doctor in the middle of the night. I ended up getting a fever that was too high, and it wasn't getting any better. That was 5 days ago. I'm feeling so much better now, but I'm still sick and exhausted. I haven't even worked up the courage to look out the window this morning to check the tree line to see if this thing is still there. Every now and then, I'll see someone standing in the trees or something. Ever since I saw whatever the hell I saw back there, weird things have been happening on the farm. The office was completely trashed one morning, almost like a wild animal had gone through it. Nothing was taken. Even the food was just thrown about. However, there were a few bloody smears in really hard to reach high places that looked like handprints, which is most likely what convinced the owners to call the police. Some of the workers have been complaining about seeing a stranger hanging around the farm, but nobody ever agrees on what he looks like. Some people who live close to the farm have even said that they seen a stranger following them home. One of the guys has said that he thought he saw an animal out in his front porch the other night. He said he saw its eyes reflecting in the field, which is when he opened the door and he greeted this animal with a shotgun. He's around 60 or so. He said that when he saw this animal, it looked like a weird type of dog, but it was way too big, and its eyes were all wrong for a dog. Now, the part that gets me though, is that nobody has reported seeing the thing that I saw at first. But then again, who would actually say something? Like I said, weird things have been going on around the farm. I'm not sure what's going on out here. I'm fucking terrified to where I don't even want to go outside no more. I've been reassigned into the office instead, so I'm just handling the back end of things, putting in numbers and working in the computer, which is where I'm actually typing this from. People have been saying that there's been livestock going missing, or sometimes they're just found dead out in the woods. I'm starting to think that there's something living out here. I'm not sure, but I gotta go. These numbers are due within the next 30 minutes. If anything else happens, I'll give you all an update whenever I can.